She had been publicly humiliated in front of the entire emergency room for daring to question the hospital's most powerful surgeon. 40 minutes later, that same surgeon stood frozen over a dying man, hands shaking, monitors screaming, blood pooling faster than anyone could stop it, while every trained physician in the room looked at each other and did nothing. The patient had maybe 90 seconds before his heart gave out, and the only person in that building who knew exactly what to do was the quiet blonde nurse they'd just threatened to fire. She stepped forward anyway. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where we tell the stories the hospitals don't want you to hear. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The fluorescent lights above Bay 4 had been flickering for 3 days, and nobody had fixed them, and nobody was going to. That was the thing about Hargrove Memorial Hospital. The small failures accumulated the way sediment did, layer by quiet layer, until they became the floor everyone walked on without noticing anymore. The maintenance request had been filed twice. Both times it vanished into whatever administrative void swallowed every complaint that wasn't attached to a physician's signature. The lights buzzed at a frequency that worked its way into the back of your teeth if you stood under them long enough, and the nurses had stopped mentioning it, and the residents had never started, and Dr. Marcus Vale had certainly never noticed because Marcus Vale did not look at ceilings. Marcus Vale looked at the middle distance while other people moved around him, and the middle distance always looked back with appropriate admiration. Emily Sato was at the scrub sink at 6:47 in the morning, working surgical soap past her wrists in the methodical pattern she'd learned before she'd learned anything else about medicine, watching his reflection in the mirror without appearing to watch it. He was tall, mid-50s, the kind of man who wore his professional reputation the way other men wore expensive watches, conspicuously, constantly, with the specific anxiety of someone who needed you to register it. Board-certified trauma surgeon. Department chief. The physician whose name appeared on the newly renovated East Wing in letters large enough to read from the parking structure. Dr. Marcus Vale was Hargrove Memorial's institutional centerpiece, the face the administration sent to every gala, every press release, every ribbon-cutting ceremony where they needed someone to look both competent and photogenic. And he had occupied that position for long enough that he'd genuinely stopped being able to distinguish between his reputation and his actual ability. He was talking. He was always talking at shift change, because shift change was an audience whether it wanted to be one or not. "I don't care what your field assessment was," he said, loud enough to carry across 2 bays. "You're a nurse. You take vitals, you follow orders, you document what I tell you to document. You do not diagnose. You do not recommend treatment, and you absolutely do not contradict my clinical judgment in front of my team." Emily turned off the faucet. She dried her hands slowly, one finger at a time. "The patient's lactate was 4.2, she said. "That meets threshold for septic shock. I flagged it because the current treatment plan doesn't account for it. I have been practicing medicine for 19 years. I'm not questioning your experience." "Then what exactly are you doing?" She turned and looked at him directly, which she already knew was a mistake and did anyway, because some things cost what they cost. He was standing in the center of the bay with 2 residents flanking him, and 3 nurses within earshot, arms crossed in the posture of a man who used his body to end conversations. "I'm telling you what the labs show," she said. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. She counted. "Get out of my bay," Vale said, and his voice had dropped, which was worse than when it was loud. Loud was performance, quiet was something else. "And if you ever question my clinical judgment in front of staff again, I will personally make sure you are walked out of this building by security before the end of that shift. Are we absolutely clear?" Emily lowered her eyes. Not because she agreed with him, not because she was afraid of him, exactly, but because she had learned, in places and circumstances that bore no resemblance to this emergency room in Crestfield, Oregon, that there were moments when winning the argument meant losing the war. She had learned that lesson in the dark, at altitude, with rotor wash flattening everything horizontal and a patient bleeding out in the back of a helicopter, in a country she was not officially supposed to have been in. She stepped out of the bay without another word. Behind her, she heard one of the residents, a second-year named Tristan Merck, who was good at lines and terrible at hiding his feelings, exhale slowly through his nose. She didn't catch words. She caught tone. Uncomfortable, helpless. The specific quiet of someone who understood exactly what had just happened and had already decided the cost of saying so was too high. She knew that tone. She'd heard it from people who outranked her, people who agreed with her in private and couldn't afford to show it in public, people who watched wrong things happen and did the math and kept walking. She didn't blame Tristan Merck. She'd done the same math herself, in situations with considerably higher stakes than a shift change argument in Western Oregon. She walked to the supply corridor, stood with her back against the wall for 11 seconds, and breathed. Then she went back to work. Hargrove Memorial sat at the western edge of Crestfield, a mid-sized city where the Cascade foothills flattened into valley farmland and the rain came in sideways from October through March. It was a level 2 trauma center, 214 beds, a cardiac unit that had gone $3 million over budget, an emergency department that was perpetually understaffed and perpetually held together by nursing staff. While the surgeons debated protocol in hallways, they never cleaned up after themselves. The hospital had won a Regional Excellence Award 2 years running. The award sat in a display case near the main entrance where visitors could see it. The staff walked past it without looking. Emily had been there 8 months. She'd come from somewhere else. That was how people described it when they didn't have specifics, and Emily didn't provide specifics. She'd arrived in January with a current nursing license, a trauma certification, and a lease on a studio apartment 11 minutes from the hospital by the route she preferred, which avoided the stretch of Route 9 where the guardrails were the wrong height. She'd cleared credentialing, completed orientation, and within her first 2 weeks had been noted by charge nurse Dolores Mack as someone who worked quiet but worked fast and never needed to be told something twice. From Dolores, that was a significant endorsement. Dolores Mack had been at Hargrove for 24 years and had the particular economy of language that came from watching too many people waste time on words when action was available. What Emily's personnel file said, RN, BSN. 8 years clinical experience, trauma certification, prior employment listed as federal contractor with a redacted agency designation, and a contact number that routed to a general DoD information line. What her personnel file did not say, 8 years with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the unit the Army called Night Stalkers, the unit that flew into places other units wouldn't and extracted people other units couldn't reach. Medevac crew. 14 deployments across 3 theaters. The kind of medicine you practiced when the surgical suite was a cargo bay and the operating table was a litter and the anesthesia was whatever you had in the bag and the margin for error was approximately 0 because below you was either ocean or desert or mountain and above you was everything trying to bring you down. She didn't tell people that. She didn't tell people much of anything if she could avoid it. She showed up. She did her job. She went home to the studio apartment and made food and sat by the window and watched the rain move across the valley. And she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, on no particular schedule, to want less than she used to want. Less speed, less intensity, less of the feeling that every second contained a decision that would determine whether someone lived or died. It was harder than it sounded. The training didn't switch off. The instincts didn't switch off. You just had to find somewhere to put them that didn't get anyone killed and didn't get you fired. So far, that was going about 60% well. The morning after the confrontation with Vale, Emily was assigned to triage. She understood immediately what it meant, and so did Dolores, and neither of them said so directly because there was no point. Triage was essential work: intake assessment, vital signs, severity sorting, the unglamorous infrastructure that kept an emergency department from collapsing under its own volume. And it was also where you sent nurses you wanted to remind of their position. Away from the trauma bays, away from the surgical cases, away from anything that might give them the opportunity to demonstrate competence in a context that made attending physicians uncomfortable. Emily took the triage assignment, noted her location on the board, and went to work. She was on her second hour when Dolores appeared at her elbow with a clipboard and an expression that meant something formal was developing. HR wants you at 10, Dolores said. About yesterday. About yesterday. Dolores set the clipboard on the counter and glanced at the waiting room, which had 11 people in it, and at least 3 that Emily had already flagged for expedited assessment. Vale filed a formal grievance at 8 this morning, insubordination. Emily continued writing. The patient he was treating for a UTI is now in the ICU. I know. Septic shock, lactate of 4.2 when I flagged it, probably 6 or higher by the time they caught it. I know that too. Dolores's voice dropped half a register. She's stable now, for what it's worth. They caught it. Eventually. A pause that carried weight. Listen, I'm not here to tell you how to handle this, but what I can tell you is that Vale has had HR in his corner for a long time. He has the board in his corner. He has this hospital's malpractice insurer in his corner. He has been here so long that the building itself is partially organized around his preferences. That is not a fight that goes well for people who challenge it head on. I wasn't challenging anyone. I was reading a lactate result. I know what you were doing, Dolores said quietly, but that's not what gets written in the incident report. She picked up the clipboard. 10 o'clock. Third floor. Gerald Marsh. Emily nodded and went back to the intake form in front of her. Sumki. Gerald Marsh ran the HR meeting with the efficiency of a man who'd conducted this particular conversation many times and had developed a personal script that he trusted more than the actual circumstances in front of him. He was late 40s, carefully dressed, with the manner of someone who'd been told repeatedly that he was skilled at de-escalation and had accepted that description as a core personality trait. He used the phrase professional environment 7 times. He used chain of command 5 times. He used collegial expectations twice, which was 2 more times than that phrase had any business being used in a conversation about a patient who'd nearly died from an undertreated infection. He did not once ask what the patient's lactate level had been. He did not ask what had happened to the patient after. At the conclusion of the meeting, he informed Emily that she was being placed on a formal performance improvement plan, effective immediately, that any further instances of what he termed disrupting established clinical authority would result in suspension pending review, and that her rotation was being reassigned from the trauma bay to the general medical floor beginning the following Monday. She signed the form. She did not argue. She thanked Gerald Marsh for his time in a tone that gave him nothing to work with, and she rode the elevator back to the ER and changed her rotation on the board and finished her shift. In the break room at 3 in the afternoon, she ate half a granola bar and sat with her hands flat on the table and thought, without wanting to, about a ridgeline in a country she was contractually prohibited from naming, where a 22-year-old from a small town in Iowa named Marcus Delaney had been losing blood from a shredded axillary artery, and she had packed that wound in total darkness with her bare hands, while the helicopter took fire, and the crew chief shouted range and altitude data over comms, and Marcus Delaney had lived and gone home, and now sent her a Christmas card every December without fail, addressed to the apartment, because she'd given him the address when he asked, and she hadn't been able to explain why she didn't want him to have it. She thought about what it had taken to learn to do that. She thought about what it meant that she was now officially prohibited from applying any of it to a trauma bay in Crestfield, Oregon. She finished the granola bar. She went back to work. She did not think about it again. Well, 3 days passed. She worked the general medical floor and was good at it in the way she was good at everything. Not perfectly, not without friction, but with the deep practical competence of someone who understood that medicine was medicine regardless of the setting, that care was care, that the patient in front of you was the patient in front of you and deserved the same attention whether you were in a combat theater or a community hospital on a Tuesday night. She administered medications and changed dressings and talked to family members in the hallway and documented everything thoroughly and had 2 separate disagreements with physicians that she handled better than the first one, meaning she found ways to flag the clinical issues without making them feel like challenges, which was a skill she was still developing and did not particularly enjoy developing. On the 4th day after the HR meeting, she picked up a double shift because Rodrigo, the night nurse, had called out sick, and she was covering when the overhead paging system crackled at 11:19 p.m. Trauma alert. Bay 1. Multiple casualty incoming. All available trauma personnel to the ER immediately. She was on the 2nd floor. She kept moving. Bay 1 was not her rotation. She had 14 patients on the medical floor, 2 of them 24 hours post-surgical, one of them a 91-year-old named Mrs. Adayez Okafor with community-acquired pneumonia and a persistent, determined interest in removing her own IV line whenever she believed no one was watching. She kept moving. 11 minutes later, the 2nd page came. Trauma alert, Bay 1. Requesting all surgical nursing staff. Code trauma. Coda trauma. She stopped walking. Code trauma was different from trauma alert. Trauma alert meant something serious was incoming. Code trauma meant the situation had already exceeded what the available personnel could manage. It meant things were going wrong faster than the team could respond. It meant the gap between what was needed and what existed had become critical. Emily stood in the hallway of the second floor, pager in her hand, for approximately 4 seconds. She went to room 214, knocked twice, looked in on Mrs. Okafor, confirmed the IV was intact and the oxygen saturation was acceptable, and the old woman was awake and watching a nature documentary at low volume. She told her she would be back in 20 minutes. Mrs. Okafor looked at her with the specific skepticism of someone who had been in hospitals long enough to know that 20 minutes was a variable unit of measurement. "I'll be back," Emily said again, and meant it, and went downstairs. She smelled it before she pushed through the ER doors. Blood, metabolic waste, the sharp overlay of saline and antiseptic working against something that wasn't being contained fast enough. She'd learned to read emergency situations by smell before she'd learned to read them by monitor. The smell moved faster than the data, gave you the first half second of information before the instruments caught up, and that half second had mattered, in other places, more than she liked to think about. The smell said this was bad. Bay 1 confirmed it. A multi-vehicle accident on Route 9, the 4-lane that curved through the valley east of Crestfield. A commercial truck had lost control in the rain, crossed the median, and triggered a chain reaction pileup involving 6 vehicles. 2 fatalities at the scene. 4 patients transported. The first ambulance had arrived 14 minutes ago. The second was backing into the bay now, and the third was 8 minutes out, and the department was already running at capacity. Emily stood in the doorway and took the room apart in 3 seconds. 2 trauma nurses, Jamie Rice and Chris Ovanesian, both working at their absolute ceiling. A second-year resident named Priya Nair, trying to coordinate 2 simultaneous tasks and visibly losing ground on both. A surgical attending she didn't recognize, pulled in from the floor because the regular trauma team was stretched past its limits. And in the center of Bay 1, standing at the primary gurney with his hands at his sides and his face very still, was Marcus Vale. Not working, standing. The patient on the gurney was a man in his mid-40s, motorcycle protective gear cut partially away, blunt force trauma to the pelvis and lower abdomen. Massive enough that the shape of him under the trauma drape was wrong in ways that meant structural damage. The monitors showed a blood pressure of 72/38 and a heart rate of 131 and a trajectory that did not require medical training to read. He was losing volume faster than the 2 large-bore IVs running wide open could replace it. The blood moving out of him was outpacing the fluid moving in. She crossed the room. "What's the bleed site?" she said to Jamie, who looked up from the IV site with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for a specific kind of person to walk through the door and had almost stopped believing it would happen. "Pelvic ring disruption," Jamie said, keeping her voice even through visible effort. "We think bilateral internal iliac involvement. Maybe right external, too. He's been losing volume for 11 minutes, and we can't get ahead of it." Emily looked at the patient. She looked at the monitors. She looked at Vale. He was still at the side of the gurney with his hands at his sides. His face had the particular stillness of someone whose training had reached its edge and found nothing behind it. She had seen that face before, not on him specifically, but on people in other situations, people who were genuinely skilled until the situation exceeded the specific category of their skill, and then they stopped because they had never been taught what to do when stopping wasn't an option. "Dr. Vale," she said, "are you calling it?" He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Something that wasn't anger and wasn't relief and wasn't anything she had a clean word for. "We're managing the situation," the monitor alarmed. Pressure dropped to 66/34. "You're not managing it," Emily said. "Not cruel, not aggressive, just accurate. The way field assessments had always been accurate, because in the field, inaccuracy had a body count. He's going to arrest inside 60 seconds if we don't mechanically control this bleed right now. I am aware of, then let me help you." She was already moving toward the supply cart. "File whatever you need to file afterward. Right now I need you out of this specific spot." He moved. She didn't know if it was a decision or a reflex, and it didn't matter. She called to Jamie for the largest bore available. She called to Chris for a draw sheet. She addressed Priya without looking at her. "Call Orr right now. Tell them pelvic ring disruption with suspected bilateral iliac hemorrhage, 2 large-bore IVs running, patient hemodynamically unstable. We need a suite open in 4 minutes, not 5. 4. That's the surgical attending started. Pelvic binding is ATLS standard, Emily said, her hands already positioning. Wrap at the level of the greater trochanters, not the iliac crests. That's the error people make. You close the pelvic volume, you reduce the space the blood has to fill, you buy time for the OR. Jamie, right hand on the right femoral triangle, firm direct pressure, right here. She guided Jamie's hand without stopping her own movement. Chris, I need you on the left side. When I say pull, you pull and hold. Or says 4 minutes, Priya said, her voice steadier now that there was something specific to do. Good. Tell them we're coming. Emily positioned the sheet. Pull. They pulled. She cinched and secured, and the room was entirely silent, except for the monitors and the sound of people working, and after a moment that lasted longer than it should have, the pressure readout shifted. 69/37. Then 72/39. Not good numbers. But not falling numbers. Move him, Emily said. Binder stays. Nobody touches the binder. If his pressure drops below 60 on the way up, call it immediately. The transport team took over. The gurney moved. The room exhaled. Emily stepped back and stood in the center of Bay 1, with her pulse at 94 and her hands completely steady, and the fluorescent light above her doing its familiar damaged flicker. She became aware, incrementally, that everyone in the room was looking at her. Not the way they usually looked at nurses. A different kind of looking. Vale was still near the wall. She hadn't forgotten he was there. She looked at him now, and he looked back at her, and the expression on his face was something she genuinely could not categorize. It was not anger. It was not gratitude. It was older than both of those, and less comfortable, the expression of a man who has just watched someone do effortlessly something that he could not do at all, and is in the process of deciding what to do with that information. Where did you learn that? He said. His voice was flat. Not hostile, just flat. Emily stripped off her gloves. She dropped them in the biohazard bin. Some lessons only get taught in places most people never go, she said. She turned and walked toward the door. She had 14 patients upstairs and Mrs. Okafor's 4 to check and 3 hours left on a double shift, and the night was still fully dark outside the ER's sliding glass doors. And the rain was coming in sideways the way it always did in Crestfield in October. And none of that had changed. She pushed through the double doors and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the second floor and waited. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. Her pager vibrated. She looked down at it, expecting a floor notification, a patient alert, something routine. What she saw instead stopped her breath for exactly 1 second before her training kicked back in and her breathing resumed and her face went neutral and her mind went very, very still. It was not a hospital notification. It was not a clinical alert. It was a message format she recognized from a different life, routed through a channel that had no business existing on a hospital communication system, addressed to a designator that had been officially retired along with her commission. 7 words and a coordinate set. She read it twice. The elevator doors began to close. She put her hand out and stopped them and stood in the gap, holding the doors open, reading the message a third time as if repetition would change what it said. It didn't change. Somewhere below her, in the ambulance bay, the third vehicle from the Route 9 pileup was pulling in. The manifest had been updated since dispatch. The patient inside was no longer just a trauma case. The patient inside was something considerably more complicated than a trauma case, and the people who had just paged her on a decommissioned military designator were somewhere in this building or very close to it. And the distance between her quiet life in Crestfield, Oregon, and the life she'd been trying to leave was collapsing faster than she had any way to stop. She stepped back. The elevator doors closed. She stood very still in the small moving box as it rose toward the second floor, and she thought about Marcus Delaney's Christmas cards, and the studio apartment with the window that faced the valley, and the particular silence of a life that asked nothing of her except to show up and be careful. Then she thought about what the message said, and she understood that the silence was over. The elevator doors opened on the second floor, and Emily stepped out and stood in the hallway for 3 seconds, doing nothing except letting her nervous system recalibrate, which was something she'd learned to do in the years when recalibration was the difference between a good decision and a catastrophic one. The message was still on the pager. She didn't need to read it again. She had the kind of memory that retained things she wanted to forget and forgot things she wanted to keep. And those 7 words and that coordinate set were already stored in the part of her brain that didn't have an off switch. She went to room 214 first. Mrs. Okafor was awake, IV intact, the nature documentary replaced now by something involving competitive cooking, the volume still low. She looked at Emily with the measuring gaze of a woman who had lived long enough to read people accurately and quickly. "You were gone longer than 20 minutes, Mrs. Okafor said. "I know. I'm sorry. Someone needed you more than I did." "Someone needed something," Emily said, which was as close to the truth as she was going to get tonight. She checked the IV site, checked the oxygen saturation monitor, checked the urine output in the collection bag and noted it in the chart. Everything was within acceptable range. Mrs. Okafor was doing what she was supposed to be doing, which was more than could be said for most situations Emily found herself in. "You should sleep," Emily said. "I'll sleep when I'm ready." Mrs. Okafor looked at the television. "You should also sleep. You look like someone who hasn't slept correctly in a long time." Emily didn't answer that. She updated the chart, dimmed the bedside light, and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her. In the hallway, she took out the pager again. The coordinate set placed the origin point of the message approximately 400 meters northeast of Hargrove Memorial's main entrance, close enough to be watching the building. The routing channel was a legacy Special Operations Communications protocol that had officially been decommissioned 18 months ago, which meant whoever had sent this either had access to systems they shouldn't have or was someone who'd kept infrastructure running off the books for exactly this kind of contingency. Neither option was comforting. The 7 words were, "Package incoming, stay with it, do not engage." Package was field terminology. It meant a person of interest. It meant someone being moved, protected, or extracted. It meant someone that other people very much wanted to get to before the right people could. The 3rd ambulance from Route 9 was downstairs right now. Emily put the pager in her scrub pocket and went back to her floor. She spent the next 40 minutes doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. She checked her 14 patients in sequence, documented accurately, administered a 2 a.m. medication round, talked a post-surgical patient named Gary through the specific anxiety of waking at night in a hospital room and not knowing immediately where he was or what had happened to him. Gary was 53, a contractor, appendectomy complicated by a minor adhesion, and he was fine, but frightened. And frightened people at 2 a.m. needed someone to sit on the edge of the chair beside their bed and speak in a normal tone of voice about normal things until the fear receded to a manageable level. Emily did that. She was good at it. She was better at it than she'd been when she started at Hargrove, which meant she was getting better at the parts of this life that didn't involve crisis, which was probably a good sign, probably progress, probably exactly what the VA counselor she'd seen twice and then stopped seeing would have called a positive indicator. She was in the medication room at 2:43 a.m. when the ER called up. Not a page. An actual phone call to the floor station, which was unusual enough that Terrence, the other nurse on the medical floor tonight, leaned into the medication room with his eyebrows elevated. "It's Jamie Rice," he said. "She's asking for you specifically." Emily put down the medication tray and went to the phone. "What is it?" she said. "The patient from the 3rd ambulance," Jamie said. Her voice was controlled but tight in the way voices got when the speaker was standing in a situation they didn't have a category for. "Bay 3. He's stable for now, but there's something—" A pause. The sound of movement in the background, people, equipment, something that clanged once and was caught. "There are 2 men here. They came in 20 minutes ago. They said they're federal. They showed credentials to Dr. Vale, and he let them into the bay." "What kind of federal?" "The kind whose credentials I didn't get a clear look at before Vale moved them through. They're in with the patient right now. Both of them." Another pause. "Emily, this patient came in with a GSW to the left flank, blunt trauma to the head, and what looks like a stab wound to the right shoulder that somebody tried to close in the field with materials that are not anything I recognize from a standard kit. Whoever worked on him before we got him knew what they were doing, but they were working fast and without the right supplies." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Is he conscious?" she said. "In and out. When he's in, he's asking for someone. Not by name, by—" Jamie lowered her voice further. "He keeps saying a word. I don't know what it means. Sounds like a call sign." "What word?" Jamie said it quietly. It was 2 syllables. It was a call sign Emily recognized because she had heard it used exactly once, 4 years ago, in a briefing she was not supposed to have attended, in a room that did not appear on any facility map. The medication room felt very small. "I'll be down in 5 minutes," Emily said. "The federal guys—" "I'll handle it," Emily said, and hung up, and stood for a moment with her hand still on the phone, looking at the wall of medication drawers without seeing them, her mind doing the rapid triage that 8 years of operational work had made automatic. Assess. Prioritize. Identify the variables you can control and the ones you can't. Build the most accurate picture possible of what you're actually walking into before you walk into it. What she was walking into was something she had been specifically told, via a decommissioned military channel, not to engage with. She went downstairs anyway. She'd never been good at that particular instruction. Bay 3 was at the far end of the ER, past the trauma bays and the crash carts and the supply corridor, in a section of the department that was slightly more separated from the main flow of traffic, which was probably not accidental. The curtain was 3/4 drawn. Through the gap she could see a figure on the gurney, male, broad-shouldered, somewhere between 40 and 50, face abraded and swollen on the left side, the shoulder dressing thick and recently changed. His coloring was bad. Not dying bad, but depleted bad. The particular pallor of someone who had been losing blood and fighting and running and doing all 3 at once for longer than a body could comfortably sustain. Beside the gurney stood 2 men in civilian clothes, suits without ties, both of them oriented away from the curtain gap and toward the patient. One was on a phone, speaking quietly. The other was standing with his arms crossed, looking at the patient's chart in a way that suggested he was reading it, but thinking about something else. Emily pushed the curtain aside and walked in. Both men turned. The one with the phone lowered it without ending the call. "This bay is restricted," the one with the chart said. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, brown hair, the flat eyes of someone who had been trained to remain unreadable and had taken to it naturally. "I'm the nursing staff assigned to this patient," Emily said, which was not technically true but was not a lie she was going to lose sleep over. "We've got coverage. You've got 2 people without medical credentials standing next to a man with 3 separate traumatic injuries and a BP that I'm guessing is sitting around 90 systolic based on how he looks right now." She moved past them to the monitor. She was right. 88/56. Heart rate 108. Oxygen sat at 94%. "What medications has he received since arrival? That's not your concern. It becomes my concern when his pressure drops below 80 and I'm the one running the code." She picked up the chart from the second man's hands with the particular efficiency of someone who did not ask permission for things within her professional scope. He let her take it because she moved like someone who was going to take it regardless. "Who intubated him?" "He's breathing on his own." "Yes, and his SAT is 94, which means he's working for it. Has anyone ordered a chest film?" The younger one with the flat eyes looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his partner. Something passed between them, wordless and fast. The shorthand of people who'd worked together in conditions where full sentences were a luxury. "He can't be moved for imaging," Flat Eyes said. "Why not?" "That's not information I can share with you." Emily put the chart down. She checked the IV lines. 2 of them, both running, one with a saline drip and one with what had been documented as a broad-spectrum antibiotic, which was appropriate for the presentation but was going to be insufficient by itself if he had internal bleeding they hadn't located yet. She palpated his abdomen lightly, and he flinched even in his semi-conscious state, which told her something. She checked the original field dressing under the hospital bandaging on his shoulder, which someone had neatly replaced but which retained traces of the original closure material. She looked at it for a long moment. It was a modified Ketosan hemostatic dressing, the kind used in forward operating environments. Not impossible to obtain outside military channels, but unusual. The suturing underneath it was fast and functional and not pretty, the kind of work you did when you had 3 minutes and inadequate light, and the goal was survival rather than aesthetics. She'd done that kind of work. She knew what it looked like. "Where was he picked up?" she said. "Ma'am," the phone man said, and his tone had shifted slightly. "I need you to step outside." "His abdomen is guarding," Emily said. "He may have a slow bleed we haven't identified. If he does, and you keep him in this bay without imaging and without a surgical consult, he will decompensate before morning, and the conversation we're having right now will be the last useful thing either of us does tonight." A silence. Then the patient moved. It was not a dramatic movement. It was the specific movement of someone pulling themselves up through layers of sedation and pain because they had something that needed to be said, which was a kind of determination Emily recognized because she had seen it in people who had no business being conscious, and were conscious anyway through the specific stubbornness of people who were not finished. His eyes opened. They were dark, very steady, despite everything, and they found her immediately with the precision of someone whose threat assessment training was still running even when the rest of him was barely functional. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he said quietly and with great effort, and in a voice that was rougher than gravel and more certain than it had any right to be, "Night Stalker." It was not a question. The two federal men went very still. Emily looked at the patient and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a clinical term for. Recognition. The particular weight of a shared history with someone you'd never personally met but had been adjacent to in the dark, doing the same terrible necessary work in the same terrible necessary places. "Rest," she said. "I've got you." He closed his eyes. His blood pressure on the monitor read 86/54 and was trending in the wrong direction. She turned to the two federal men. "Get me a surgical attending," she said, "right now. Not Vale. Anyone but Vale. And get me a portable ultrasound because I need to rule out intra-abdominal hemorrhage in the next 10 minutes, or this conversation stops mattering." Flat Eyes looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded once to his partner, and his partner stepped into the corridor. Emily turned back to the patient and started working and did not think about the pager message or the decommissioned channel or the coordinate set or any of it, because right now there was only this: a man who needed someone who knew what they were doing, and she was the person who was here. The surgical attending who arrived was a woman named Dr. Renata Obi, 40-something, pulled from the on-call room where she'd been sleeping in her clothes the way on-call surgeons always slept, fully dressed and ready to move. She came in without complaint, took one look at the patient, took one look at the monitors, took one look at Emily, and said, "Talk to me." Emily talked. She was concise. She gave Renata the presentation, the vitals trend, the field dressing assessment, the abdominal guarding, the oxygen saturation trajectory. She gave it in the order a surgeon needed it, prioritized by urgency, without editorializing. Renata listened without interrupting. That was how Emily knew she was good. "Portable ultrasound," Renata said when Emily finished. "Requested it 4 minutes ago. Get me a type and cross if it hasn't been done." "It hasn't. I'll do it now." "And someone needs to tell me who these two are," Renata said, looking at the federal men with the specific expression of a surgeon who has been woken from sleep and brought to a complicated situation and is now assigning blame in real time. "Federal," the younger one said. "That's not a medical specialty," Renata said. "Step back or step out." He stepped back. Emily noted that and filed it away without showing it. She drew the type and cross while Renata performed a rapid physical assessment, and the portable ultrasound arrived 6 minutes later, which was faster than Emily had expected, and which meant someone in the department was actually running tonight. And Renata performed the fast exam herself with practiced speed and found what Emily had suspected: a small but active collection of fluid in the left upper quadrant, consistent with splenic laceration, slow bleeding but present and not going to resolve on its own. "He needs the OR," Renata said. "He can't be moved," Flat Eyes said. "He will be moved," Renata said, "or he will die in this bay. Those are the options I have available. You can call whoever you need to call, but you have approximately 15 minutes before this stops being a conversation about logistics and starts being a conversation about what went wrong." Another silence, longer this time. The phone man made a call. It lasted 90 seconds. Emily couldn't hear the other side of it, but she watched his face during those 90 seconds and read it the way she'd learned to read situations in the field. Not by the words, which were controlled, but by the micro-expressions that moved through the muscles around his eyes and the set of his jaw when he received information he hadn't anticipated. He'd received information he hadn't anticipated. He lowered the phone. He looked at his partner. He looked at Emily with an expression that had changed, subtly but definitely, from the flat professional neutrality he'd maintained since she walked in. "He can be moved," he said. "Good," Renata said. "Let's go." Emily did not go to the OR. That was Renata's territory, and she didn't intrude on it. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 3 after the gurney moved and thought about what had just happened and what it meant and what was likely to happen next. And none of the answers she arrived at were comfortable. The patient knew her designator, or knew enough to recognize it, which meant either he had been briefed on personnel from the 160th before this operation began, or he had been in enough operational environments to have encountered her name or her call sign attached to an action, or, and this was the possibility that made the fluorescent light above her feel very bright and very close, someone had told him specifically to look for her, which meant that someone had known she was here, in this hospital, in this city, before tonight. She didn't like that option. She turned it over and looked at it from several angles and kept not liking it. She was still standing in the corridor when Marcus Vale appeared at the end of the hallway. He was in street clothes. He'd been off shift for 2 hours, she realized, which meant he'd come back. He was moving with purpose, and his face had an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that didn't fit the usual range. He wasn't angry. He wasn't imperious. He looked like a man who had received news that required him to be somewhere specific, which was a different thing entirely. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He stopped. They were 15 feet apart in an empty corridor at 3:20 in the morning, and the silence between them had a texture that Emily had learned to pay attention to. Not hostile silence. Something else. The silence of two people who have both arrived at the same location from completely different directions and are now trying to figure out what that means. "You're here late," Emily said. "I forgot something," he said. It was a bad lie. He knew it was a bad lie and made no effort to improve it. She looked at him. He looked at her. She became aware of two things simultaneously: that he was looking specifically at the corridor leading to Bay 3, not at her, and that his phone was in his hand with the screen dimly lit in a way that suggested a recent message. "What did you forget?" she said. He pulled his attention back to her face. Whatever he'd been calculating behind his eyes resolved into something that looked like a decision. "Go home, Sato. Your shift ends at 6. "I'm covering a double." "Then stay on your floor." He said it differently than he'd said similar things before, not with authority, not with the performance of authority, but with something that sounded, underneath the surface, almost like urgency. Not toward her, away from something. "Stay on the medical floor tonight. Don't come back down here." He walked past her toward the exit. Not toward Bay 3, toward the exit. Emily turned and watched him go and stood very still for a long moment in the corridor with the overhead light buzzing its familiar frequency and the smell of antiseptic and recycled air surrounding her, and she thought about what he'd just said and how he'd said it, and what he'd been looking at when he thought she wasn't watching. Her pager vibrated again. She looked down at it. Different message, same channel. 4 words this time. "Building is not secure." Somewhere in the OR above her, a man whose name she didn't know was on a table with a splenic laceration and a field dress stab wound and a blood pressure that had been trending wrong, and he had looked at her with dark, steady eyes and said the name of her unit like a password, like she was the specific person he'd needed to find. And somewhere in this building, something was wrong in a way that the 2 federal men in Bay 3 had not been told about. And Marcus Vale, who had no reason to be here at 3:20 in the morning, had just told her to stay upstairs and stay out of it, which was advice she had been given in one form or another her entire adult life and had never once successfully followed. She put the pager back in her pocket. Down the far corridor, the door to the stairwell opened from the inside, and 2 figures stepped through it wearing scrubs that were the right color for Hargrove Memorial but the wrong fit, and carrying supply bags that were the right shape for medical equipment and the wrong weight, because Emily had carried enough bags in enough places to know the difference between the weight of medical equipment and the weight of something else entirely, and what those 2 people were carrying was not medical equipment. Her whole body went quiet in the way it did when the situation had just changed into something that required a different kind of thinking. She did not move. She did not reach for anything. She stood in the corridor and breathed slowly and watched the 2 figures move through the department, and she counted the distance between them and the stairwell that led to the OR. And she began, very quietly and without any visible sign of what she was doing, to plan. She gave them 40 seconds. That was the window, the time between when 2 people entered a space they didn't belong in and when they committed to a direction, a target, a course of action that became harder to interrupt with each passing second. 40 seconds was the operational window for intervention, before a situation calcified into something that required force to resolve, and Emily did not have force available tonight, which meant the next 40 seconds were the most important 40 seconds of the last 8 months of her life. She moved. Not toward them. That was the instinct, and the instinct was wrong. Two people, unknown capability, unknown armament, moving with the specific directional confidence of people who knew where they were going inside a building they'd never been in before, which meant they had a floor plan, which meant this had been planned with a lead time measured in days rather than hours. Going at them directly in a corridor with no cover and no backup was not a plan. It was a gesture. Emily had learned the difference between plans and gestures in environments where gestures got people killed. She went sideways. The supply corridor that ran parallel to the main ER hallway connected Bay 3 to the medication room, to the equipment storage, to the staff locker area, and it was used primarily by nursing staff moving between locations without crossing the main floor. And Emily had used it every shift for 8 months, and knew every door in it and which ones locked from which side. She went through the first junction, cut left, moved fast and quiet, in the way that was not running. Running attracted attention and made noise, but was something else, something that ate distance efficiently without announcing itself. She needed a phone, not her pager. A phone because the people she needed to reach were not reachable through the hospital's internal system, and were not reachable through any channel that could be monitored by whoever had just walked through that stairwell door in the wrong weight scrubs. She needed Flat Eyes and his partner, and she didn't know where they were. She needed to know where in the OR suite the patient was, and she didn't know that either. What she knew, 2 people were moving through the emergency department with equipment that wasn't medical equipment, heading toward the stairwell that accessed the OR floor. The OR suite had 3 entry points: main OR corridor, service elevator, and a back stairwell used for equipment transport. If she were planning this and she had a floor plan, she'd have coverage on at least 2 of them. Probably all 3 if she had the personnel. She didn't know how many personnel. She reached the staff locker room, pushed through the door, went directly to her locker. Her phone was inside. Personal cell. Not the hospital-issued one, which she didn't trust for this. And she had it unlocked and was moving through her contacts before she'd finished turning around. The number she needed wasn't in her contacts under a real name. It was listed as a plumbing supply company in Medford with a 7-digit number that routed, through 2 redirects she didn't have visibility into, to a duty officer at a facility she'd never been to. She'd been given the number at her out-processing and told she'd probably never need it, and to keep it anyway, because the people who said that always knew there was a chance. She dialed. It rang twice. A voice answered with a 4-digit verification request. Emily gave the 4 digits she'd memorized 3 years ago and had never used. There was a pause of approximately 8 seconds. Authentication, she assumed, running her designator through whatever system still had her on file as a decommissioned asset with residual contact authorization. Then a different voice. Awake, alert, not surprised to be receiving a call at 3:30 in the morning. "We know," the voice said. "We have eyes on the building. Who's inside?" 2 tangos through the east stairwell, ground floor, heading up. Wearing Hargrove scrubs, wrong fit, carrying bags, wrong weight. I have a patient in OR2 with a splenic lac, and at least 1 federal minder who may not know the building's been penetrated. We have 1 confirmed additional inside, possibly 2. Entry point? Service dock, 22 minutes ago. Emily processed that. 3 confirmed, possibly 4, which was a full team for a contained operation inside a building with limited exits and a patient who couldn't be moved. They weren't here to extract the patient. They were here to eliminate him. Eliminate the intelligence he was carrying before it could be retrieved and processed, which meant they knew what he had, and they knew he'd been brought here, which meant the leak was either in the federal team or above it. "You're 2 in the building," she said. "Where are they?" "We've lost tracking. Last confirmed position was the 2nd floor, OR corridor, 14 minutes ago. Lost tracking." Which meant either the men had gone somewhere the monitoring didn't reach, or they'd done something to prevent being tracked. Neither option was acceptable. "I need you to get someone inside," Emily said. "ETA on ground team is 11 minutes. "That's too long." "It's what we have." She was already moving back out of the locker room. "Tell them east entrance, staff badge required. I'll have someone at the door. And someone needs to loop in hospital security right now, not through the front desk. Directly to the security supervisor. His name is Dwight Pellerin. He's ex-Portland PD and he's competent. Copy. And the two federal in Bay 3 need to know their building is not secure. They may already be in a position where we'll handle the federal coordination, the voice said. Stay out of the OR. That patient is why I'm here. Sato. The voice shifted weight slightly. Not a command. Something closer to a request, which was more unusual and therefore more concerning. We need him alive and we need whatever he's carrying intact. If you go into that OR and this goes sideways, we lose both. Let us bring the team in. She stood in the supply corridor with the phone against her ear and the overhead light buzzing, and 11 minutes feeling like a number that had been arrived at by people who were not currently inside the building. 11 minutes, she said. 11 minutes. I'll clear the path, she said, and hung up. The east stairwell had a badge reader. Emily had badge access to every floor as part of her double-shift credentialing, which was standard for nurses covering multiple departments. And she used it now, taking the stairs to the third floor at a pace that was fast enough to matter and controlled enough to be sustainable, because sprinting up 2 flights of stairs and arriving unable to regulate her breathing was not a useful outcome. Third floor. The OR suite occupied the north half. Recovery occupied the south. The connecting corridor ran between them with a nurse's station at the midpoint that was minimally staffed at this hour. 1 circulating nurse, 1 anesthesia tech. The attending and her team scrubbed in for the emergency case. She came out of the stairwell and stopped. The corridor was empty in the way corridors shouldn't be empty. There was a supply cart overturned near the nurse's station. Not dramatically, not thrown, not crashed, but tipped, the way something got tipped when a person moved past it quickly in the dark and clipped it and didn't stop to right it because stopping wasn't an option. The nurse's station was unoccupied. The monitoring screens were on. A cup of coffee sat on the desk with steam still rising from it, which meant whoever had been sitting there had left inside the last 4 minutes. Emily's chest tightened. She kept it out of her face and her movement. She went to the station and looked at the OR monitoring screens. Or 1 was dark, no active case. Or 2 showed active vital signs, which meant Renata Obi was still in there, still working, which meant the patient was still alive. The vitals on screen were not good. Pressure sitting at 79/44, heart rate 124, oxygen sat at 97% on ventilator support. But they were present and they were not in freefall, which meant the splenic repair was in progress and going as well as could be expected given the presentation. She needed to know where the circulating nurse had gone. She needed to know where the 2 people from the stairwell were. She needed to know where the additional tango the duty officer had mentioned on the 2nd floor was. She had 3 questions and no answers, and approximately 9 minutes of lead time before the ground team arrived. And she was standing at a nurse's station in a dimly lit surgical corridor at 3:30 in the morning, holding a personal cell phone and wearing scrubs, which was not an impressive tactical loadout. She thought about what she had available. She thought about this the way she'd been trained to think about it. Not what she wished she had, which was a different and useless exercise, but what was actually present in this specific environment and how it could be used. The supply cart. The medication room 20 feet to her left, which required a badge and contained controlled substances, and the kind of pharmacological tools that could, in the right application and the wrong context, be genuinely dangerous. The OR suite itself, which had 2 entry points and a team inside who did not know they were working in a building that had been penetrated. She needed to warn Renata. She picked up the OR intercom at the nurse's station. The circulating nurse, she checked the board, the name was Felicia Strand, would normally monitor this, but Felicia Strand was not at the station. She pressed the intercom for OR2, static, then a voice muffled by the mask. Strand, what is it? This isn't Strand, Emily said. This is Sato, medical floor. Dr. Obi, I need 30 seconds. A pause. The sounds of an operating room in progress, equipment, monitors, the specific acoustics of a room full of people concentrating. Then Renata's voice, clipped and careful. You have 20. There are individuals in this building who are not staff and are not authorized federal personnel. I have reason to believe OR2 is a target. I need you to lock down from the inside and do not open the OR doors for anyone who doesn't provide you a verbal confirmation code. The code is Nightfall. Say it back. Another pause, longer. Nightfall, Renata said. Her voice had changed. Not panicked. Renata Obi did not panic. Emily was already certain of that, but recalibrated. absorbing new information and adjusting without stopping the work. How long? 8 minutes, maybe less. We're in the middle of a splenic repair. I know. Keep going. Don't stop working. Just don't open those doors. Understood. A breath. Sato. Yeah. Don't get yourself killed out there. I'm going to need someone to explain this to administration in the morning. Emily almost said something and didn't. She released the intercom. She heard the magnetic lock on OR2 engage with a solid, definitive thunk from 20 feet away. Good. She moved away from the nurse's station because standing in an illuminated, fixed position was the worst thing she could do right now, and she'd already been there too long. She went to the supply cart, righted it against the wall, and used the repositioning to scan the corridor in both directions under cover of the motion. Empty to the south. A shadow at the far north end that might have been a person or might have been the cart storage alcove playing tricks in the low light. She watched the shadow for 4 seconds. It moved. Not much. A shift of weight. A change in the way the shadow connected to the floor. A person standing very still and not quite still enough. One person. North end. Between the supply alcove and the door to the service elevator. She didn't know where the second one was. She thought about the floor plan. If she were positioning for this, 2 people, objective is OR2, you need to control the corridor and you need to control the exit. She'd put one at the north end to manage the service elevator approach, and she'd put the second somewhere with a line on the OR entry doors, which meant the second person was either in the south section of the corridor or was inside one of the ancillary rooms, the equipment storage, the anesthesia supply room, the staff bathroom at the corridor midpoint. She looked at the staff bathroom door. The light underneath it was off, which was normal. The door was fractionally ajar, which was not. That door had a self-closing pneumatic hinge. It closed automatically every time. She knew this because she'd come up here twice during previous shifts to use that bathroom specifically because it was quiet and because the self-closing hinge meant you had a moment of privacy before anyone could get in. The door did not stay open on its own. Someone was holding it. Emily stood in the corridor between 2 people she couldn't engage directly and an OR suite with a locked door and a patient who was still bleeding on the table, and she made a decision in approximately 2 seconds that she was not entirely comfortable with and made anyway. She walked to the medication room. The medication room on the surgical floor was accessed by badge, stocked for post-operative pain management and anesthesia support, and contained, among other things, a drawer of sedative agents that were drawn and documented by the anesthesia team prior to each case. It also contained, on the top shelf of the supply cabinet, a biometric lockbox of paralytic agents for rapid sequence intubation. She was not going to use paralytic agents on anyone. She was very clear with herself about that. But the medication room had something else she needed, which was a phone with a direct line to the security desk that bypassed the main hospital operator, and it had a door that locked from inside. And it had, on the counter, a charged defibrillator cart that had been restocked after the last case and not yet returned to the crash cart outside. She went inside. She locked the door. She picked up the direct security line. It rang 4 times, and she was starting to rethink the entire approach when it picked up. Security. The voice was alert but puzzled. Nobody called this line at 3:30 a.m. This is Nurse Sato, medical floor. I need Pellerin directly. Not dispatch. Pellerin. He's not on tonight. He's been called in. Check your radio. A pause. Shuffling. Then a different voice, rougher, with the cadence of someone who'd gone from asleep to operational in under a minute and was not happy about it but was functional. Pellerin. 3rd floor surgical corridor, Emily said. 2 confirmed unauthorized individuals, possibly a 3rd. 1 at the north end near the service elevator, 1 in or near the staff bathroom, midpoint. The OR is locked down. I need you to pull your 2 best people and come up the east stairwell, badge access. I've cleared it. And I need someone on the service elevator controls right now to prevent them from using it as an exit or an entry. Who called you? Federal contact. Your confirmation should come through your radio in the next 2 minutes. Should. Will, she corrected herself. Pellerin, I have a patient in surgery who is a federal protective asset and 2 people outside that OR who are not here to help him. I need your people on this floor in 4 minutes. A silence of the type that meant a person was making a rapid assessment of their own and arriving at conclusions they didn't entirely like. 4 minutes, Pellerin said. East stairwell. He hung up. Emily stood in the locked medication room and breathed and counted, because counting was something to do that wasn't nothing, and nothing was the one option she couldn't afford. 1 minute and 40 seconds later, her phone buzzed. A text from the number she'd called earlier. 2 words. Team inbound. Then, 12 seconds after that, she heard something from the corridor outside. Not loud. A sound that most people would have categorized as a door and dismissed. Emily categorized it correctly as a door being moved by someone who did not want it heard, which was different, and which meant the person in the staff bathroom had made a decision about timing and had moved from waiting into acting. She looked at the medication room door. She looked at the defibrillator cart. She looked at the layout of the room and the position of the door and the angle of approach from the corridor, which she had committed to spatial memory, the same way she committed all spaces to spatial memory, because old habits were old habits, and some of them she'd decided to keep. She positioned 3 seconds before whoever was on the other side produced something that overrode it, which told her they had hospital systems access they shouldn't have had, which added a layer to this that she was going to have to think about later. And the door opened, and the figure came through the doorway in the low crouch of someone trained to enter spaces quickly and neutralize threats before the threat could respond. Emily was not where the threat was supposed to be. She was to the left of the door rather than in front of it, which was not where a nurse would naturally position herself and was exactly where she needed to be, and the figure's momentum carried them 2 steps into the room before they registered the spatial error. And in those 2 steps, Emily closed the distance and used the technique that worked when you had no weapon and no backup, and needed to control a larger person's movement without killing them, which was not a simple technique, and was not something she'd learned in a hospital, and left marks that took days to fade. The figure went down hard against the supply cabinet. Not unconscious. She hadn't been trying for unconscious, which required force she wasn't comfortable applying without knowing the full situation. But controlled, movement compromised, the specific wrist and shoulder lock that made continuing to be a problem genuinely painful and mechanically difficult. "Don't," she said quietly. The figure, male, she could tell now, compact build, somewhere in his 30s, with the close haircut and the stillness of someone who was already recalculating rather than fighting, went still. She held the lock and used her free hand to pull the medication room's emergency call cord, which triggered an alert at the nurse's station and at the security desk simultaneously, and then she waited, because waiting was what she had. 40 seconds later, she heard voices in the corridor. Then a knock. 3 short, 1 long, which was the pattern Pellerin's team used and which she knew because she'd asked him to use it when she'd been at Hargrove for 2 weeks and had quietly introduced herself and her background and established exactly this kind of contingency, because old habits were old habits, and some of them kept you alive. "Clear," she called. The door opened. 2 security officers, both of whom she recognized, both of whom looked at the scene in the medication room with expressions they were professionally suppressing. Behind them, Pellerin himself, 50s, gray hair cut close, the build of a man who'd spent decades in physical work and hadn't stopped, took in the room in one sweep. "1 down," Emily said. "1 at the north end of the corridor, unknown on the 2nd floor. Ground team ETA should be under 5 minutes. "North end is secured," Pellerin said. "My people took him when he moved toward the OR doors. He wasn't armed, but he had override credentials for the hospital's badge system." "I know. He used them on this door." Pellerin looked at the figure on the floor, then at Emily, then at his officers. "Take him downstairs. Separate room, separate officer. Nobody talks to him until the federal people get here." He waited until they'd moved before he looked at Emily fully. "You want to tell me how a floor nurse knows 3-1 patterns and override credential vulnerabilities?" "I want to tell you after the building is secure," Emily said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who had learned to accept good answers even when they were deferred. "Fair enough." The ground team arrived in 6 minutes, not 5, which was 1 minute slower than advertised, and which Emily had already accounted for in her planning because nothing in the field ever ran on schedule. They came through the east entrance in civilian clothes, 4 people, moving with the compacted efficiency of a unit that had done this particular type of building entry many times, and Pellerin's badge access had the door open before they arrived, which saved 40 seconds Emily was glad to recover. The team leader was a woman. Emily noticed that and noticed herself noticing it and set it aside. Compact, dark-haired, late 30s, with a controlled urgency that communicated that she was taking the situation seriously without allowing the urgency to become speed for its own sake. She identified herself to Pellerin as Agent Rosalind Varga, Federal Task Force, and produced credentials that Pellerin examined for 3 seconds before returning. She looked at Emily with the specific attention of someone cross-referencing a face against a file they'd read recently. "Sato," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "You cleared the 3rd floor." "Pellerin's team took the North End Tango. I contained the bathroom. There's a possible 3rd somewhere on the 2nd floor your duty officer flagged. And there's something else." Emily said it without inflection because the inflection would have been anger, and anger wasn't useful right now. "Someone with hospital access facilitated this. They had a floor plan. They had badge override credentials. That doesn't happen from the outside." Varga absorbed this. "You have a candidate." "I have an observation," Emily said carefully. "What you do with it is your jurisdiction." "Tell me anyway." "Dr. Marcus Vale was in this building at 3:20 a.m. in street clothes with no documented reason to be here. He went to the ER corridor near Bay 3 before the penetration and then left toward the main exit rather than the clinical areas. He told me to stay on the medical floor and not come back downstairs." She paused. "He didn't tell me why. He didn't ask why I was there. He just told me to stay away from the thing that was about to happen." Varga was quiet for a moment. "You think he knew?" "I think the most charitable interpretation is that he was warned and chose to leave rather than report it," Emily said. "The less charitable interpretation has more moving parts. We'll need you to walk us through the timeline. After the OR is secure and my patient is out of surgery." Something shifted in Varga's expression. Not softness, but a kind of recalibration, the adjustment a person made when they updated their model of who they were talking to. "Your patient." "He's in my hospital," Emily said. "That makes him my patient." Varga held her gaze for a moment, then looked at her team leader and gave a hand signal Emily recognized as clear to proceed. The team split, 2 to the 2nd floor, 2 to establish a position outside OR2, and Varga stayed in the corridor with Emily and Pellerin and the particular quiet of a situation that had reached the management phase from the crisis phase, the in-between space where the immediate danger was contained, but the larger structure of what had happened was only beginning to become visible. "He's been under for 18 months, Varga said. Not offering information, Emily recognized, testing the limits of what Emily already knew. The intelligence he is carrying represents the terminal phase of an operation that has been running since before either of us was involved. "I don't need the operational background," Emily said. "No. But you need to understand why the people who came tonight came tonight." Varga looked at the OR door at the end of the corridor. He was supposed to make a transfer 48 hours ago. It didn't happen. The people on the other side of this have been tracking the delay, and they've been mapping the possibilities. Hargrove was on the list because... She stopped. "Because someone told them he'd been brought here," Emily finished. "Yes." "Someone with access to federal medical transport routing." "Yes." Emily looked at the OR door. The vital signs monitor visible through the small window in the corridor showed the patient's pressure at 84/51 and stabilizing. Renata was doing her job. She was doing it well, in a locked room, with incomplete information about what was happening outside her doors, because Emily had told her enough to lock the door, and she'd trusted that and kept working. Emily thought about that for a moment. The specific trust of a person who couldn't verify what they'd been told and acted on it anyway, because the alternative was worse. She'd been on both sides of that equation at different points in her life, and she knew the weight of both positions. "Vale," she said. "How long have you known?" Varga looked at her. "We've had indicators for 6 weeks. Nothing actionable. He's careful, and he has institutional protection, and..." A pause. "And we needed the patient to complete the transfer before we could move on Vale without burning the operation." Emily heard what was underneath that. "You knew he was a risk to the patient, and you left the patient in his hospital anyway." "We believed the timeline was controlled." "You believed wrong." Varga didn't argue. That was something, at least. The OR intercom at the corridor station crackled. Renata's voice came through, clipped and specific. "We're closing. 20 minutes. Pressure is holding at 89/57. He's going to make it." Emily let out a breath she hadn't fully acknowledged holding. 20 minutes, she said. We'll have the corridor fully secured by then, Varga said. Emily nodded. She looked at the window at the end of the corridor where the Crestfield night was visible in the gap between the OR wing and the adjacent building, the sky beginning the first barely perceptible shift from absolute black toward the dark blue that preceded dawn by about an hour. She'd seen that color from the back of a helicopter more times than she could count, coming in or going out, and it always meant the same thing. The night had made its moves and you were still here, and the next phase was beginning whether you were ready or not. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number that wasn't in her contacts. Routed. She recognized the format, through the same relay as the earlier messages. But this one was different. This one was not operational communication. This one was 3 lines, and the third line made the floor feel briefly less stable than it had been a moment before. The first line was a name, an operational name, 12 characters, that she recognized as the patient's designation in whatever task force structure he'd been embedded in. The second line was a status update, transfer authorized, recovery site confirmed. The third line was secondary target identified, Hargrove Medical. Individual Vale, Marcus D., financial records recovered from package. Extent of compromise exceeds medical staff, federal level. Emily read it twice. Then she looked up at Varga, who was watching her with the particular attention of someone who already knew what the message said and was waiting to see how the recipient processed it. You've already seen this, Emily said. 2 minutes ago, Varga said, my team recovered a data device from the patient's clothing during triage. Your attending flagged it and secured it per protocol. A pause. It names 7 individuals. Vale is on the list. He's not at the top. Emily looked at her. The person at the top, Varga said carefully, has been coordinating the access that made tonight possible. Has been coordinating it for substantially longer than 6 weeks. She paused again, and the pause was the kind that preceded information that recontextualized everything before it. And that person currently holds a position on Hargrove Memorial's board of directors, with concurrent advisory roles in 2 federal healthcare oversight bodies. The corridor was very quiet. Emily thought about 8 months. She thought about the performance improvement plan and the signed form, and Gerald Marsh using the phrase chain of command 5 times in 40 minutes. She thought about the way institutional protection worked, the way it didn't announce itself but simply arranged the environment so that certain people never faced consequences and certain other people found consequences everywhere they looked. She thought about a woman in the ICU who'd nearly died of septic shock while her lactate level was ignored. She thought about what it meant that the thing she'd been fighting inside this building for 8 months was connected, through channels she hadn't been able to see, to the thing she'd spent 8 years fighting before she came here. How high does it go? She said. Varga looked at her steadily. Higher than I'm authorized to tell you in a hospital corridor at 4 in the morning. Somewhere below them, in a building that had been penetrated and partially cleared and was not yet fully secure, a door opened and closed with a sound that carried up through the stairwell, and both Emily and Varga turned toward it at the same moment, and Pellerin's radio crackled with a voice reporting that the second-floor sweep had found the 3rd unauthorized individual. Not a person, as it turned out, but a device, a transmitter, compact and sophisticated, and placed behind the electrical panel in the second-floor medication room in a position that would have given someone outside the building real-time audio of the ER bay communications for however long it had been running, which meant that every conversation near Bay 3 tonight had been heard, which meant the people who'd come into the building tonight had known, in real time, everything that was said in the ER, which meant they'd known the OR was locked down before they reached the 3rd floor, which meant they'd known the team was coming. Emily turned that over once and arrived at the conclusion she didn't want to arrive at, which was that the 2 people she'd helped contain tonight had not been trying to reach the OR. They'd been positioned to hold a perimeter while a 3rd action happened somewhere else in the building. Varga, she said. I know, Varga said, already moving. Recovery Bay, South Wing. If the OR was the decoy, Emily was already running. The South Wing Recovery Bay was 63 steps from the OR corridor, and Emily covered them in a way that was not quite running and was faster than running because it was controlled and directional and didn't waste energy on anything except getting there, with Varga 2 steps behind her and Pellerin's voice on the radio ahead of them, calling positions to his team in the clipped shorthand of someone who'd spent 20 years doing this in a different context and hadn't lost the instinct. The recovery bay had 4 beds, and was currently occupied by two post-operative patients from earlier in the evening, neither of them the federal asset, neither of them in any immediate danger from whatever was happening, but both of them present and vulnerable in the way that sleeping people in hospital beds were always vulnerable, which was a factor Emily was tracking even while she tracked everything else. The recovery nurse on duty was a man named Salvatore Quintero, 26 years old, 18 months out of nursing school, the kind of person who was good at his job in normal circumstances and was currently standing against the far wall of the recovery bay with his hands at his sides and an expression that Emily read in half a second as controlled fear, which meant he was conscious and unharmed and had been told to stay still by someone who'd made the instruction convincing. The someone was standing beside bed 2 with a device in his hand that was not medical equipment and was not a weapon in the conventional sense, but was something Emily recognized from a briefing she'd attended 4 years ago about the specific vulnerabilities of networked hospital monitoring systems. It was a transmitter injector, compact enough to fit in a lab coat pocket, capable of interfacing with the hospital's patient monitoring network and introducing false vital sign data, which would trigger automated alerts and pull staff from wherever they were to wherever the system said the emergency was. A distraction device, not a weapon. A tool for creating controlled chaos in a specific location while something else happened somewhere else. But the person holding it was not the primary concern, because the primary concern was the person standing at the medication cabinet on the recovery bay's east wall with his back to the door and a set of keys in his hand that Emily recognized as the override keys for the controlled substance lockbox, which meant he was not here to distract and was not here to monitor, and the cabinet he was accessing contained, among the standard post-operative analgesics, a sufficient quantity of potassium chloride in concentrated form to stop a heart in under 4 minutes, if administered without the dilution protocols that governed its legitimate clinical use. The person at the cabinet turned when Emily came through the door. It was Gerald Marsh, HR director, 47 years old. The man who had used the phrase chain of command 5 times in a 40-minute meeting and had not once asked about the patient whose lactate level had triggered the complaint that brought Emily to his office. He looked at her, and the specific quality of his surprise was not the surprise of a person who had not expected to be found, but the surprise of a person who had expected to be found later, after the relevant work was done, and was recalculating the timeline on the fly. "Sato," he said, as if they were in the hallway, as if this were a scheduled interaction. "Step away from the cabinet," Emily said. "You're not supposed to be on this floor." "Step away from the cabinet, Gerald." He looked at her, and then he looked at the door behind her where Varga had come through with her hand already moving toward her holster, and the calculation he was running behind his eyes resolved into something that wasn't surrender exactly, but was the specific stillness of a person who had determined that the current action was no longer executable and was moving to a contingency. He stepped away from the cabinet. The man with the transmitter injector made a decision at the same moment, and it was the wrong decision, which was to move, and Varga was faster and more direct than the situation required, and the man went down without ceremony and without significant damage and stayed down, and Salvatore Quintero made a sound against the wall that was somewhere between a gasp and a word and ended up being neither. "Sal," Emily said, not looking away from Marsh. "Are you hurt?" "No," Salvatore said. His voice was unsteady but functional. "The 2 patients in the bay, are they stable?" A pause while he checked. She heard him move, heard the monitoring sounds she'd learned to read like a second language. "Stable, both of them." "Good. Stay with them." Varga had the man on the floor secured with a speed that suggested she'd done it recently and often. She looked up at Marsh with the particular attention of someone who had been looking for a specific person for a specific amount of time and was now experiencing the complicated feeling of arrival. "Gerald Marsh," she said, "I have a federal warrant for your detention pending investigation into unauthorized disclosure of protected federal medical transport data, conspiracy to obstruct a federal protective operation, and She paused, and the pause was deliberate. "Accessory to attempted murder of a federal asset." Marsh looked at her. He looked at Emily. Something moved across his face that was not quite the emotion she'd expected, which would have been fear or anger or defiance. What moved across his face was something older and more tired than any of those. The expression of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been relieved of it in the worst possible way and was not entirely sure how to feel about the relief. "I want a lawyer," he said. You'll have one, Varga said. Hands. He put his hands out. He didn't resist. She cuffed him with the specific efficiency of someone for whom this was a procedural step rather than a dramatic moment, and that efficiency was, Emily thought, more deflating for Marsh than anything else could have been. The reduction of whatever he'd imagined this moment would be into simple administrative process. Emily went to the medication cabinet. The override key was still in the lock. She turned it back, removed it, and checked the contents. The potassium chloride was present, undisturbed. He hadn't gotten there yet. She documented the cabinet status in her head: time, condition, witness present, because documentation was documentation regardless of what kind of night it had been. And the chain of evidence mattered, and she knew how to maintain it. Behind her, Varga was on her radio, relaying the recovery bay status in the compact operational language of someone filing a report while the situation was still live, and Pellerin's team was visible through the recovery bay window in the corridor beyond. 2 officers moving in the purposeful way of people who'd been given specific locations and were clearing them methodically. The building was coming back under control. Emily could feel it the way you felt weather systems shift. Not in any single thing, but in the aggregate of everything, the reduction of uncertainty in the air. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the specific exhaustion of a situation that had taken everything available and consumed it completely. By 5 a.m., Hargrove Memorial had 4 federal agents on site, 2 of Pellerin's security teams stationed at the OR corridor and the recovery bay respectively, 3 individuals in custody being held in separate rooms pending transport, and a hospital administrator named Clifton Barr. The overnight duty administrator, a nervous man of 50 who wore his institution's crises personally and visibly, trying to understand what had happened to his building in the last 3 hours while standing in the hallway outside the security office with a cup of cold coffee and an expression of sustained disbelief. Emily had given her initial statement to Varga at 4:40 a.m., standing in the recovery bay with Salvatore Quintero still watching the 2 sleeping post-op patients as if they might require defense. She'd been thorough and specific and unemotional about it, which was the only way she knew how to do this kind of accounting. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because feelings were not useful data in this context, and she'd learned to schedule them for later, when the work was done and the people who needed protecting were protected. At 5:15, OR 2 opened. Renata Obi came through the doors with her mask pulled down around her neck and the particular physical deflation of a surgeon at the end of a long, complicated case. She looked at the federal agents in the corridor and at Pellerin's officer and at the general state of a surgical floor that had been through something it wasn't designed for, and she absorbed it with the equanimity of a person who had, over the course of this night, recalibrated her understanding of what her working environment contained. She found Emily at the nurses' station, where Emily was updating the OR monitoring records with the case closure time and the patient's exit vitals, because the documentation still needed to happen regardless of everything else. He's in recovery, Renata said. Splenic repair, clean closure. Pressure is holding at 96/61 on reduced support. He'll need monitoring for the next 12 hours, but the structural damage is addressed. Any complications during? Twice his pressure dropped below where I wanted it. We managed both. She paused. There was a point, about 40 minutes in, where I heard something in the corridor and I genuinely considered opening the OR door to find out what was happening. I'm glad you didn't. So am I, apparently. Renata looked at her steadily. The word you gave me, nightfall. Where did that come from? It's a protocol word, Emily said. Means what I told you it meant. And you knew it because I've been in situations where knowing it mattered. Renata was quiet for a moment, looking at Emily with the specific attention of a person who is updating a significant assumption they'd been carrying. I've worked with you for 8 months, she said. I thought you were a trauma nurse with a military background. I am. That's a significant understatement. It's an accurate one, Emily said. The rest of it is... She considered her words. The rest of it is not mine to explain right now. Renata looked at her for another moment, then nodded, the nod of a person who accepted the boundary and would file the question for later. Is he safe? The patient? Getting safer. Good. Renata pulled the mask completely off and tucked it in her pocket. I'm going to go write my operative report, and then I'm going to sit in the on-call room and stare at the ceiling for a while. That sounds reasonable. Sato. Renata stopped. You locked this floor down tonight. Whatever the rest of it is. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Emily nodded. Renata walked toward the on-call room and Emily watched her go and then went back to the documentation because the documentation wasn't going to finish itself. At 6:20 a.m., with the day shift beginning to arrive and the overnight staff beginning the handoff process that was both the most routine and most critical transition in hospital operations, Varga found Emily in the break room on the third floor with a cup of coffee that had been hot 20 minutes ago and a chair that she'd been in long enough that standing up was going to require a specific decision. She stood up. Some decisions were better made preemptively. We've confirmed the transmitter in the second-floor medication room has been in place for approximately 9 days, Varga said, taking the chair across from her without being invited, which Emily didn't mind. Which means the people who came tonight had 9 days of ER communications to work with. How much did they get? Enough to know the asset had been brought in. Not enough to know the OR had been locked down until we locked it down, because the transmitter didn't cover the OR intercom. That was a gap in their intelligence. A gap I created, Emily said, not with pride exactly, but with the factual acknowledgement of someone accounting for variables. Yes. Varga looked at her coffee and then at Emily. The data device the patient was carrying. I can tell you the summary of what's been confirmed so far, because you're going to hear parts of it through channels that won't give you the full picture, and you deserve the full picture. Emily said nothing, which was permission. Gerald Marsh has been a paid facilitator for a network that operates primarily through institutional access, hospitals, federal health advisory boards, medical data systems. He's been in place at Hargrove for 6 years. His role was access management, ensuring that specific individuals maintained positions within the institution. That specific oversight didn't happen. That specific complaints went nowhere. Emily heard the last part and let it settle. The performance improvement plan, she said, was filed at Marsh's direction. Vale filed the grievance because Vale files grievances against anyone who creates friction for him, and he's been allowed to for long enough that it's become automatic. But Marsh processed it faster than standard protocol, assigned it higher severity than the complaint warranted, and expedited the rotation reassignment. We believe he was managing the ER personnel configuration to ensure that specific staff were not in positions where they could observe things he needed unobserved. Emily sat with that for a moment. The specific texture of it, the way the mundane machinery of institutional bureaucracy had been used as a concealment mechanism, the way the performance improvement plan and the reassignment and the 40-minute meeting about professional environment had all been instruments of something she hadn't known she was adjacent to. She had thought she was dealing with an arrogant surgeon and a captured HR process. She had been dealing with that and also with something considerably larger, and the two had been so thoroughly braided together that separating them hadn't been possible from the inside. Vale, she said. Vale is more complicated. Varga's expression shifted slightly, not softening, but acquiring a kind of precision that meant she was about to say something she'd thought carefully about. He's not in the network the way Marsh is. He's not a paid facilitator, and he doesn't have the same operational role. But he has been receiving financial consideration, routed through a medical consulting firm that turns out to be a shell structure, in exchange for providing institutional cover. Not doing anything specific, just being the person whose name and reputation made certain questions less likely to be asked. He knew someone was coming tonight. We believe he received a warning through the consulting firm channel, a warning that told him to be absent when the operation happened. He came back, and we think this is accurate based on the timing and his behavior when you encountered him, because something in the warning made him want to confirm the situation before he left. He wasn't there to facilitate. He was there to reassure himself that the patient would be dead before morning. Varga didn't answer that directly, which was an answer. Emily finished her coffee, even though it was cold, because the alternative was leaving it unfinished, and she'd developed a specific aversion to leaving things unfinished. Where is he now? Vale is being interviewed by federal investigators at a location off-site. He came in voluntarily, which his attorney advised him to do, which his attorney will shortly realize was not the advice that served his client's interests best. A pause. The financial records from the data device are specific: dates, amounts, routing, 19 months of transfers. His medical license review is going to be, she chose the word carefully, consequential. Consequential. Emily turned the word over. For 19 years, Vale had been the gravitational center of this institution, the force around which everything else organized itself. Nurses had been reassigned. Complaints had been dismissed. Patients had been undertreated while the person responsible for treating them stood in the correct posture of clinical authority, and the institution arranged itself to protect him because he was valuable, and because value in institutional medicine was measured in reputation and in revenue and in the size of the lettering on the wing of the building that bore your name. And in the end, what had brought him down was a data device in a patient's clothing and 9 months of a nurse refusing to lower her assessment of what she was seeing even when the cost of maintaining it was professionally significant. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt tired in the way that came after sustained effort, the specific physical and cognitive depletion of a night that had asked for everything she had and received it. Triumph was a feeling for later, if it came at all. Right now, there was just the morning shift arriving and the handoff to complete in 14 patients on the medical floor who needed their 7 a.m. assessments. "I need to finish my shift," Emily said. Varga looked at her. "You've been on since yesterday afternoon." "I know. The investigators are going to need additional time with you today. I'll be available after 11. I need to do the handoff." She stood. Her left knee, which had taken the worst of the corridor movement during the night, reminded her of its existence with the specific persistence of an injury that wasn't serious but wasn't going to be courteous about it. "Is the patient secure?" "2 federal officers in the recovery bay. Renata Obi's team is monitoring him directly. He's stable." Varga paused. "He's asking about you." Emily picked up her cold coffee cup and carried it to the sink. "Tell him to rest." "He said—" Varga stopped, then said it anyway. "He said to tell the Night Stalker that the package reached the destination." Emily stood at the sink for a moment with the water running over her hands. The package reached the destination. Operational language for a successful delivery, for an asset who had carried something through everything that had tried to stop it and arrived intact on the other side. It was the kind of message you sent when the mission was complete and the cost had been paid and the objective was achieved. The kind of message that meant something different, depending on how many times you'd sent it, and how many times you'd waited to receive it, and how many times the message hadn't come because there was no one left to send it. She turned off the water. "Tell him good work," she said. Well, the morning arrived the way mornings arrived after nights like that one. Not gradually, but suddenly, the light changing from the dark blue she'd seen through the OR corridor window to the flat gray of a Crestfield October dawn, in what felt like no transitional stage at all. By 7:30, the day shift was fully in place, and the overnight staff were completing their handoffs, and the hospital was doing what hospitals do in the morning, which is to resume being a hospital with the specific institutional amnesia that keeps large organizations functional, the ability to contain an extraordinary event within a defined period and then close that period and continue. Emily gave her floor handoff to the day nurse, a competent woman named Ingrid, who received the patient status updates with the thoroughness she always brought, and asked one question, which was about Mrs. Okafor's IV, which Emily answered with the accuracy of someone who had checked it at 5 a.m. during a brief return to the floor. She was in the locker room changing out of her scrubs at 7:52 when her phone buzzed with a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it. "Nurse Sato." The voice was male, older, with the cadence of someone who was accustomed to communication being precise. "My name is Director Alan Parrish. I'm calling because I've been briefed this morning on the events at Hargrove Memorial, and I understand you were central to the containment of last night's situation." "I did my job," Emily said. "That's a modest description of what the reports indicate." A pause. "I'm also calling because I've been informed that you're currently on a formal performance improvement plan initiated by staff who are now in federal custody or under investigation. I want you to know that plan is being reviewed at the administrative level and will be rescinded before end of business today." Emily sat down on the locker room bench. The knee complained again. She noted it and set it aside. "The patient in recovery," she said. "He needs at least 72 hours of post-operative monitoring before he's stable enough for transport. I want that on record." "It's noted." "And the 2 post-op patients in the recovery bay who were present during the incident last night, They need a trauma-informed check-in from someone qualified. They didn't ask to be in the middle of a federal operation, and they probably don't fully know what they were in the middle of yet, but they'll figure it out, and they'll need support when they do. A pause. I'll make sure that's arranged. The recovery nurse, Quintero. He handled an extremely difficult situation competently and without training for it. That should be acknowledged. Noted. And Pellerin's security team cleared 2 targets from a floor they weren't expecting to clear tonight. Hospital security is not configured for this kind of operation, and they performed well because Pellerin runs a good team. That should go somewhere in writing. There was a pause on the other end of the line that had a different quality than the previous ones. Not the pause of someone waiting to speak, but the pause of someone who was listening to the list and understanding something about the person making it. "Is there anything you want for yourself?" Parrish said. Emily thought about it. She thought about it honestly, which was harder than it sounded, because the honest answer required knowing what she actually wanted as distinct from what she thought she was supposed to want, or what would be appropriate to ask for, or what would make the conversation easier to end. "I want the patient's treatment record to be accurate and complete," she said. "I want what I did in that OR bay and in the recovery bay tonight to be documented under my name, not attributed to the federal response team, not folded into the incident report as institutional action. I want it documented that a nurse made specific clinical decisions that kept a federal asset alive and the operation intact." "That's not a small thing to ask in this context," Parrish said carefully. "I know." Emily looked at her locker door where she'd stuck a small piece of tape on the first day to mark the correct combination because she'd been afraid she'd forget it, and she hadn't forgotten it, and the tape was still there. "But the next time a nurse in this building or any building looks at a lactate level and tells a surgeon what she sees, I want there to be a record somewhere that the nurse was right, and it mattered. That's what I want." The silence that followed was not a comfortable silence, but it was a real one. The silence of a person on the other end of a phone who had expected a different kind of request and was recalibrating around the one they'd received. "I'll see to it personally," Parrish said. "Thank you." She ended the call. She sat on the bench for a moment longer than she needed to, because the knee needed the rest and because sitting was something she hadn't done without purpose in the last several hours, and the absence of purpose was briefly unfamiliar. Then her phone buzzed again. A text, this time from Varga. It read, "Vale arrived at Federal Building 45 minutes ago with attorney. Attorney reviewed financial documentation and advised client to cooperate fully. Medical License Board notified. Administrative review initiated. Hospital board meeting called for 9 a.m. Then a second text, 30 seconds later. Board member Patricia Norwood detained at Portland International at 6:15 a.m. Travel documents suggest intended departure to non-extradition jurisdiction." Emily read that twice. Patricia Norwood, she knew the name from the hospital's organizational chart, which she'd looked at once in her first week in the way she looked at floor plans and exit routes and security camera positions, out of a habit that had never decided to leave her. Board member. Long tenured. The kind of institutional figure whose name appeared on donor walls and committee letterheads, and who moved through an organization with the invisibility of someone who had been present long enough to become part of the structure itself. At the top of the list. That was what Varga had said, standing in the OR corridor at 4 a.m. The person at the top of the list. She had been 40 minutes from a flight to somewhere that didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. She had been 40 minutes from the specific kind of disappearance available only to people with sufficient institutional access to know exactly when to run. She hadn't made it. Emily set the phone down on the bench beside her and looked at the locker room wall and sat with the knowledge that the thing she'd been inside without knowing it, the machinery of it, the weight of it, the way it had organized around her and tried to manage her and had very nearly succeeded, was now visible and was coming apart in the particular irreversible way that things came apart when the structural element at the center failed. It wasn't clean. It wasn't going to be clean. There would be lawyers and proceedings and institutional reviews and the specific slowness of accountability moving through systems that were designed to protect people who knew how to use them. Vale would cooperate and receive whatever consideration cooperation bought, and would still lose everything that his name on that wing had been supposed to represent. Marsh would be prosecuted and would spend time in a room he had not chosen and could not administer his way out of. Norwood would face the full architecture of a federal case built on the data device a man had carried through a year and a half of dangerous work and arrived at a trauma bay in Crestfield, Oregon to deliver. And somewhere in the recovered financial records and the intercepted communications and the 9 days of ER audio captured by a transmitter behind an electrical panel, there was a paper trail that led backward through years of managed neglect and suppressed complaints and patients who had not received the care they were owed because the people responsible for their care were also responsible for something else entirely. She was still sitting with that when the locker room door opened and Dolores Mack came in. Dolores looked at her. She looked at Emily's expression and the empty coffee cup she'd apparently carried in from the break room without noticing, and she sat down on the bench on the other side of the locker row and said nothing for a moment. "The day shift is talking," Dolores said finally. "I know. They don't know the details, but they know something happened. Pellerin's people are still on 3, federal vehicles in the ambulance bay." A pause. "Vale's name is going around. It will for a while." Dolores was quiet, then, "The woman in the ICU, the septic shock patient." "Mrs. Yuen," Emily said. She'd looked up the name the day after the incident. She made a point of looking up names. "She's being transferred to step-down today. Her family was told she nearly didn't make it." Dolores's voice was level, but level in the way that required effort. "They were told a nurse flagged the labs." Emily didn't say anything. "I'm not good at this," Dolores said, "at saying things. You know that." "I know." "You were right. About the lactate, about all of it." The words came out direct and without embellishment, which was the only way Dolores Mack said things that cost her. "You were right from the beginning, and we let them put you on a PIP and move your rotation, and She stopped, started again. "I told you it wasn't a fight you could win head-on. I should have stood next to you instead." Emily looked at the tape on her locker door. "You didn't know what you were standing next to," she said. "Neither did I, entirely." Still, Emily agreed. Because it was true, and it was also survivable, and both things could be true at the same time. Dolores stood. She straightened her scrubs with the habitual gesture of someone who had been straightening her scrubs in this building for 24 years. "Administration is going to want to talk to you this morning. Legal too, probably. Don't let them put anything in writing that you haven't read 3 times." "I know." "And eat something before you do any of it. You've been on since yesterday afternoon, and you look like you've been through—" She stopped and looked at Emily with something that was not quite any of the standard emotional categories, something more specific and less nameable than any of them. "You look like you've been through exactly what it turns out you've been through." She left. The locker room door closed behind her with the soft, definitive sound of institutional doors, the sound that meant one space was closed and another was about to open, and Emily sat on the bench for 30 more seconds with her left knee aching and the morning light coming through the high locker room window at the specific angle that meant it was past 8 a.m., and the day was fully underway and the night was fully over. Then her phone buzzed one more time. She looked at it. It was not a federal number. It was not a hospital number. It was a number she recognized because it had appeared on paper Christmas cards every December for 4 years, written in the deliberate handwriting of someone who had learned to write neatly as an adult, because the situation had required it, addressed to her studio apartment, in an envelope that always smelled faintly of the Iowa farmland the sender had gone back to. The text said, "Heard through a channel I'm not supposed to have that you had a long night. You okay?" She stared at it for a moment. Marcus Delaney, 26 years old, sitting on a farm in Iowa, with a scar on his right axilla and a life that existed because of a night that had cost her something she'd never found the right word for. She typed back, "I'm okay. Go back to sleep." His response came in 11 seconds. "Night Stalkers don't quit." She almost smiled. She put the phone in her pocket and stood up, favoring the left knee without making a production of it, and opened her locker and took out her civilian jacket and her bag, and the small piece of tape that marked the correct combination, which she peeled off carefully because she'd decided she didn't need it anymore. She was almost to the locker room door when the overhead PA system activated with the specific tone that preceded an administrative all-staff announcement. The tone that meant what was about to be said was not a clinical alert, but a communication from the institutional level, the kind that came out rarely and was listened to even by people who had learned to tune out most of what the PA said. The voice that came through the speaker was Clifton Barr, the overnight duty administrator, who was apparently still in the building and had apparently decided that this particular morning required something to be said before the day shift got further into it. "Attention all Hargrove Memorial staff," he said. "Effective this morning, Dr. Marcus Vale has been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a review by the Oregon Medical Board and federal authorities. The hospital's board of directors will convene an emergency session at 9 a.m. Further information will be provided as it becomes available. All clinical operations continue as scheduled under the direction of department attendings." The PA clicked off. The locker room was very quiet. Emily stood at the door with her hand on the push bar and thought about what it would mean for this building. The specific reconfiguration of a space that had organized itself around a single gravitational force for long enough that the organization had become invisible, had become just the way things were, and what it would feel like when that force was gone and everything had to find a new way to arrange itself. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be fast. Institutions had their own inertia and their own amnesia and their own capacity to reconstitute familiar patterns in new configurations, and the work of genuinely changing what Hargrove Memorial was would be slower and harder than any single night could accomplish. But the night had accomplished something. She knew that. She was just tired enough to feel the weight of it accurately, rather than either more or less than it was. She pushed through the door. In the hallway outside, 2 nurses from the day shift were standing near the elevator with the expressions of people who had just heard the PA announcement and were processing it in real time. And one of them looked at Emily as she came out of the locker room. And what was on that nurse's face was not deference, and was not pity, and was not the particular careful neutrality that the building had trained people to use around anyone who'd been on the wrong side of a veiled grievance. What was on that nurse's face was something Emily hadn't seen directed at her inside this building before. She didn't stop to examine it. She nodded and moved toward the elevator and pressed the button and waited. And while she waited, she thought about what Parrish had said, and what she'd asked for, and what she hadn't asked for. And she thought about a data device that a man had carried for 18 months through operations she didn't have clearance to know the details of. And she thought about the fact that somewhere in that device, according to Varga, were financial records that went places and named names and constituted the kind of documented evidence that turned indicators into prosecutions. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors were almost closed when a hand came through the gap and stopped them, and Varga stepped into the elevator with the expression of someone who had been looking for her and had timed this correctly. "I have 20 floors to give you something," Varga said, "and then I need it back." She held out a single sheet of paper, folded once. Emily took it, unfolded it. It was a printed summary, 1-page classification markings at the top that she wasn't supposed to be able to read but could, because she'd read enough of them in enough context to know what they meant. The summary was of the data device's contents as they related to Hargrove Memorial Hospital specifically. She read it. She read it again. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. "Back," Varga said. Emily handed it back. She stepped out of the elevator into the main hospital lobby, where the morning was fully underway and the front desk staff were managing arrivals, and the coffee cart near the entrance was doing its reliable business. And she stood in the lobby and breathed the air of a building that was the same building it had been yesterday, and was also not the same building at all. The document had listed, with dates and figures, financial transfers from the network facilitated by Marsh and Norwood that had funded not just the access operation at Hargrove, but a parallel program operating through 3 other regional hospitals, using the same structure, the same facilitated neglect, the same managed institutional blindness to things that should not have been overlooked. And at the bottom of the document, in the specific dry language of federal summary documentation, was a single line that explained why Varga had wanted her to read it and why she'd wanted it back immediately after. It named the next location, the next hospital, the next institutional structure where the same network had established the same kind of embedded access. And it named the next person the network had placed there to manage it. The name was not one Emily recognized. The position was listed as Director of Nursing Operations. The hospital was 63 miles south of Crestfield. Emily stood in the lobby with the morning moving around her and the day shift in full operation, and Mrs. Okafor presumably eating breakfast on the 2nd floor, and the recovered patient 2 floors above that, breathing on his own with federal officers at his door. And she understood that the night was over, and also that the night was not over, that it had ended here and continued somewhere else simultaneously, the way things did when they were part of something larger than any single location could contain. She stood there for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and called the number she'd called at 3:30 in the morning, the one that routed through 2 redirects to a duty officer at a facility she'd never been to. It rang once. "We know," the duty officer said before she could speak. "We've been waiting to see if you'd call." "Brief me," Emily said. "Brief me," she said, and the duty officer did. It took 4 minutes. She stood in the lobby of Hargrove Memorial with the morning flowing around her. Arrivals, departures, the coffee cart, a child in the waiting area pressing her face against the fish tank glass. And she listened to the summary of what the data device had confirmed about the network's footprint across the region, about the hospital 63 miles south, about the director of nursing operations who had been placed there 14 months ago through the same facilitated hiring process that had been used at 2 of the other 3 identified institutions. When the duty officer finished, there was a pause. "What's the ask?" Emily said. "No operational ask. You're a civilian nurse. We don't have a framework for—" "What's the ask?" she said again. Another pause, shorter. "Consultation. The next phase is institutional review at all 4 sites. The people conducting those reviews are federal investigators and healthcare compliance officers, and they are very good at what they do, which is paperwork and interviews and systemic audit. What they are not good at is walking into a clinical environment and knowing in 30 seconds what is wrong with it." A pause. "You're good at that." "I'm a nurse." "You're a nurse who identified a compromised institutional structure from the inside, maintained patient care standards under active threat, and executed a building containment without a weapon or a warrant in the middle of a double shift." The duty officer's voice was dry but not unkind. "We're not asking you to carry a badge. We're asking you to walk through 4 hospitals and tell us what you see." Emily looked at the fish tank. The child had moved on. The fish moved in their slow, unbothered way through the water, indifferent to the building around them, indifferent to everything except the immediate and the visible. "I need 2 days," she said. "For what?" "Sleep. And I have patients here who need proper handoff before I go anywhere." "2 days," the duty officer said. "We'll be in touch." She ended the call and stood in the lobby for another moment, not thinking about anything in particular, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. The absence of active threat had created a space she hadn't had time to inhabit yet, and she was standing in it now, in the lobby of a hospital that was reorganizing itself around the removal of a structural element it hadn't known was rotten, and it was strange, and it was quiet, and it was, she recognized slowly, something adjacent to relief. Not peace. She wasn't sure she had access to peace in the way some people did, but something quieter than what had come before. She went home. The board meeting at 9 a.m. ran until nearly noon, which was longer than board meetings at Hargrove Memorial had ever run in Dolores Mack's 24 years of institutional memory. Dolores wasn't in the meeting, nursing staff weren't, but she had sources, the way people who had been somewhere long enough always had sources. And by the time Emily had slept 4 hours and showered and returned to the hospital at 2 p.m. for her interview with the federal investigators, Dolores had a reasonably complete picture of what had happened in that conference room. The board had received the federal summary of the data device findings at 9:07 a.m. By 9:40, 2 additional board members had retained separate legal counsel and requested recusal from proceedings, which was itself informative. The hospital's own legal team had advised immediate cooperation with all federal inquiries, a suspension of Vail's surgical privileges pending the medical board review, and a public statement acknowledging the administrative irregularities without specifying their full scope until the federal case reached an appropriate stage. What the public statement could not avoid specifying, the performance improvement plan filed against Emily Sato had been reviewed, found to be procedurally irregular and substantively unsupported, and was rescinded with immediate effect and expunged from her personnel file. The board had voted on that item unanimously, in under 3 minutes, with the specific speed of people trying to put distance between themselves and a decision they had previously allowed to stand without examination. Dolores told her this in the hallway outside the room where the federal investigators were waiting, standing close and speaking quietly, with the efficiency of someone who knew the value of relevant information delivered before it was needed. "Unanimous," Emily said. "Every one of them." Dolores's expression was not triumphant. It was the expression of someone who understood that unanimous votes of this kind were a form of institutional self-preservation dressed in the language of accountability, and who had lived long enough to accept that impure motives sometimes produced correct outcomes. The administrator's office also asked me to tell you that your rotation is restored as of your next scheduled shift. The trauma bay. The trauma bay. Emily nodded. She looked at the door to the interview room. How long do I have? They've been there since noon. They're not impatient. They should be. They have 3 other hospitals to review. Dolores looked at her with the measuring attention she'd had since the day Emily arrived. You're going to help them with that. It wasn't a question. I'm going to consult, Emily said, after I'm done here. Dolores was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the tone of someone making a practical statement about a practical situation, this hospital is going to be different without Vale. Not immediately. Institutions are slow. But it's going to be different, and it's going to be better. And that started when you read a lactate result and refused to pretend it said something else. Mrs. Yuen read the lactate result, Emily said. She was the one lying there producing it. Dolores almost smiled. It was the closest Emily had seen her get. Go do your interview. Emily pushed the door open and went inside. The investigators were thorough, and they were good, and they took 3 hours, which was appropriate given the scope of what needed to be documented. Emily gave them the timeline in the order it had happened, accurately and without editorializing, including the parts where she'd made judgment calls that went outside her official role, and the parts where the judgment calls had been wrong in their initial framing, even if they'd produced the right outcome. She did not perform modesty, and she did not perform heroism. She described what she'd seen, what she'd assessed, what she'd decided, and what had resulted, and she answered their follow-up questions with the same precision. At 5:15, the lead investigator, a woman named Hartley, 50s, with reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose and the energy of someone who had been conducting interviews all day and had not lost the thread of any of them, set down her pen and looked at Emily across the table. One thing I want to understand, Hartley said. You received a direct instruction from the duty officer not to engage with the situation in the OR corridor. You engaged anyway. Yes. Why? Emily thought about it the way she'd thought about it at 3:30 a.m., which was not as a moral calculation but as a practical one, because the moral part had never been in question. The instruction was based on incomplete information about the building's status. When I determined that the information was incomplete, the instruction no longer reflected the actual situation. And you made that determination unilaterally. I was the only person in the building at that moment who had both the situational information and the capability to act on it. Yes. Hartley looked at her for a moment. That's a significant amount of confidence in your own assessment. It's an accurate amount, Emily said. Not with arrogance, with the specific plainness of someone who knew what they knew and didn't see the value of pretending otherwise. Hartley picked up her pen again, made a note. The consultation role that's been discussed with you, the 4-hospital institutional review, are you prepared for what that's going to look like? Hospitals where the structure has been compromised in ways the people inside them can't see clearly from the inside. Yes, I'm prepared for that. It's not going to make you popular. It's not supposed to. Hartley wrote something, capped her pen, and looked up. Last question. In your opinion, and I'm asking for your opinion, not your official assessment, how long had Hargrove Memorial been compromised before last night? Emily thought about 8 months of working in a building without knowing what the building was. She thought about Mrs. Yuen's lactate level and the performance improvement plan, and Gerald Marsh's choice of phrase, and the way institutional protection arranged itself around the people it protected, and against the people it didn't. She thought about the transmitter that had been in place for 9 days, and the financial transfers that went back 19 months, and the consulting firm Shell Structure and Patricia Norwood at the airport, 40 minutes from a flight to somewhere without an extradition treaty. Longer than anyone in that building was comfortable admitting, she said. That's usually how it goes. Hartley nodded. Thank you, Nurse Sato. Emily stood, shook her hand, and walked out. 3 weeks later, Marcus Vale appeared before the Oregon Medical Board for a preliminary license review hearing. The hearing was not public in the formal sense, but the building where it was held had a lobby, and the lobby had people in it, and by the time Vale walked through the entrance with his attorney, the lobby contained, in addition to the standard occupants of a Tuesday afternoon, a freelance journalist who had been covering Hargrove Memorial for 10 days, two nurses from the hospital who had called in personal days, and Dolores Mack, who had driven 40 minutes and was not explaining herself to anyone. Vale looked, Dolores would later report to Emily, like a man who had aged a specific amount in 3 weeks. The kind of aging that wasn't the calendar kind, but the kind produced by sustained exposure to the reality of consequences. He was dressed well, his attorney had dressed him well, and he was composed in the external way, the practiced clinical composure that 19 years of surgical authority produces, and that functions as long as the authority is intact. The hearing lasted 2.5 hours. The board received the federal financial documentation, the personnel records, the timeline of the performance improvement plan, and its procedural irregularities, the administrative history of complaints filed and dismissed under his tenure, and the clinical record of the septic shock patient whose lactate level had been the trigger for the complaint that had begun the documentation of everything else. The board also received, at Emily's insistence and Parrish's follow-through, the complete nursing incident report from the night of the multi-vehicle trauma and the OR lockdown, attributed fully and specifically to Emily Sato, registered nurse. At the end of the hearing, the board issued a preliminary suspension of Vale's surgical privileges pending full review, a timeline estimated at 6 to 8 months, with restoration dependent on the outcome of the federal proceedings and a complete audit of his clinical record over the preceding 4 years. His medical career as it had existed was over, not with a dramatic pronouncement, not with a scene, with paperwork and process and a vote by a panel of his peers who had no particular animus toward him and were simply looking at what was documented and arriving at the only supportable conclusion. That was how accountability actually worked, Emily thought, when it worked. Not like the movies. Like paperwork. Like someone who refused to lower their assessment of what the labs showed. Gerald Marsh was charged federally on 4 counts, the least of which carried a minimum of 3 years. He'd been denied bail given the risk profile and was awaiting trial in a facility he had not been consulted about. Patricia Norwood, intercepted at the airport with travel documents and a carry-on bag containing a laptop that the federal forensics team described as extraordinarily informative, had retained the best attorney available and was building a defense that the attorney already knew was going to have difficulty with the specificity of the financial documentation. The other identified members of the network at the 3 additional institutions were in various stages of investigation, administrative leave, and federal scrutiny. The director of nursing operations at the hospital, 63 miles south, had resigned the morning after Emily's consultation visit before the federal notice arrived, which meant either the resignation was unrelated to Emily's visit, possible, or someone had called her and told her Emily was coming, which was also possible and was Varga's problem to untangle, not Emily's. Emily had done what she'd been asked to do, which was walk through 4 buildings and tell the investigators what she saw. And she had done it in 2 weeks instead of the allocated time because the buildings were not difficult to read once you knew what you were reading for. And she'd written her assessments in language that was specific and undeniable and that Hartley had called, in an email Emily received on a Wednesday afternoon, the most operationally useful institutional review documentation I have received in 11 years of this work. She'd read that email twice, filed it, and gone back to the medical floor, because she still had 14 patients, and Mrs. Okafor had been readmitted with a secondary infection and was back in room 214 watching competitive cooking at low volume and had opinions about the previous night's episode that she wanted to share. The formal acknowledgement came on a Friday. Not from the hospital, though the hospital's acknowledgement had come earlier in the week, in the form of a memo from the interim chief medical officer. Vale's replacement during the review period was an internal attending named Dr. Joanna Fisk, who was quieter and more competent, and who had, in her first week, reversed 3 of Vale's standing departmental protocols that had been creating friction for the nursing staff for years, without anyone being able to say so officially. The formal acknowledgement came from Director Parrish, in person, which Emily had not expected and which required her to stand in the hospital's main conference room on a Friday afternoon in her scrubs because she'd just come off a shift and nobody had given her adequate notice, with Varga present and Hartley present and Pellerin and 2 of his officers present and Dolores Mack present, who had apparently been told and had not told Emily because she'd decided Emily would overthink it and try to get out of it. Parrish was older in person than he'd sounded on the phone. 70s, lean, with the specific posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where posture communicated authority and had never been able to fully leave that behind. He read a formal commendation, which Emily listened to with the expression she used for information she needed to retain but didn't need to react to, and then he set the paper down and looked at her directly. "I want to say something that's not on the paper," he said. "All right," Emily said. "The people in this network were effective for as long as they were effective because they had identified which institutions were most vulnerable to the specific kind of capture they were running. Which institutions had the right kind of hierarchy, the right distribution of power, the right culture of managed silence." He paused. Hargrove Memorial had all of those characteristics. The reason the network's operation here ended the way it ended is that Hargrove Memorial also had you, and they didn't account for you. "They accounted for me," Emily said. "They put me on a performance improvement plan and moved my rotation." "And you stayed." She looked at him. "I wasn't going to leave my patients." "No," he said. "You weren't." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who was choosing the right words carefully. "The consultation work you did. The 4 hospitals. We'd like to formalize that. Not an operational role. A civilian advisory position, structured so that it doesn't compromise your nursing license or your employment here. Periodic review engagements at institutions where we have indicators but not yet actionable evidence. You walk in, you work, you tell us what you see." Emily thought about the studio apartment and the window that faced the valley and the particular quiet of a life that had been asking nothing of her except to show up. She thought about what the duty officer had said about what she was good at and what the investigators weren't. She thought about 4 buildings she'd walked through in 2 weeks and the specific clarity of knowing, in 30 seconds, what was wrong with a room that looked right from the outside. "I want something in exchange," she said. "Name it." The nursing staff at each of the reviewed institutions. Whatever the review finds about suppressed complaints or managed personnel decisions, I want the affected staff informed and their records corrected, not as a footnote, as an explicit part of the review outcome. Parrish looked at her steadily. "That's within our scope. And I want Salvatore Quintero's name in the official record of the Hargrove incident. He held a recovery bay alone at 3 in the morning with no training for it, and he didn't fail. Done. And I want to work my regular shifts. I'm not an investigator. I'm a nurse who consults. The consults happen around the shifts, not instead of them." "Agreed," Parrish said, without hesitation, which told her he'd anticipated this and considered it reasonable, which meant she'd probably underasked, which was a negotiation failure she was going to think about later. She extended her hand. He shook it. Dolores, from the side of the room, made a sound that was not quite a word and was clearly satisfied. On the first Sunday after the formal acknowledgement, Emily drove to the hospital at 6 a.m., not because she had a shift, but because she'd told Mrs. Okafor she'd stop by. And Mrs. Okafor had been in room 214 for 6 days and was improving and would probably be discharged Tuesday and had specific opinions about the quality of the Sunday morning nursing handoff that she wanted to share with someone who would actually listen. Emily sat in the chair beside the bed for 40 minutes while Mrs. Okafor explained, with considerable specificity, the difference between adequate care and attentive care, and how most of the nurses on the floor provided the former and a small number provided the latter, and how you could tell the difference not by the procedures they performed, but by whether they looked at you when they spoke or looked at the chart. "You look at people," Mrs. Okafor said. "That's not as common as it should be." "It's the most important part of the job," Emily said. "Then why don't more people do it?" Emily thought about that honestly. "Because the systems don't reward it. The systems reward speed and volume and documentation. Looking at someone takes time and doesn't produce a metric." Mrs. Okafor considered this. "You should change that." "I'm working on it," Emily said. "Slowly." "Slowly is how everything real changes," Mrs. Okafor said, with the authority of someone who had been watching the world long enough to have data on this. "Fast changes are for people who want to feel like something happened. Slow changes are for people who want something to actually be different." Emily looked at her for a moment. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle that meant it was past 7 a.m., and somewhere below them the day shift was settling in, and the coffee cart was opening, and the ambulance bay was receiving its first arrivals of the day, and the hospital was doing what hospitals do, which is to continue, regardless of everything that happens inside them and around them and to them. "Get some sleep," Emily said. "You're going home Tuesday." "I know," Mrs. Okafor said. "I'll miss the fish." There are fish everywhere if you look for them." Mrs. Okafor smiled, which was something Emily had not seen her do before. A full, genuine smile that changed the shape of her face into something younger and more complicated than the patient-in-bed version. "You're better at this than you think you are," she said. "The talking part, not just the medicine part." Emily stood. She straightened the blanket at the foot of the bed with the automatic gesture of someone who straightened blankets, the way other people straighten picture frames, out of a compulsion toward order that had nothing to do with the person in the bed and everything to do with the person doing the straightening. "Sleep," she said. She left room 214 and walked down the corridor toward the elevator, past the nurse's station where the day shift was organizing itself, past the whiteboard where the patient assignments were written in the rotating handwriting of 12 different people over the course of a week, past the supply cart that still sat in the same slightly off-center position it had sat in for 8 months because nobody had decided to move it, and Emily had never found the right moment to mention it. She moved it now. 3 feet to the left, flush against the wall, out of the traffic line. It took 4 seconds. Ingrid, the day nurse, looked up from the station. "Did you just move that?" "It's been in the way since January," Emily said. Ingrid looked at the cart's new position. "That's so much better." "I know," Emily said. "I should have done it 8 months ago." She pressed the elevator button and waited. She thought about what it meant to stay in a building after you'd been told in every available institutional language that you were not valued in it. She thought about what it cost and what it produced, and whether the accounting ever balanced out in a way you could point to cleanly. She thought about a woman in step-down care whose name was Mrs. Ewan, and who was going to go home to her family at the end of this week because someone had looked at a number and refused to pretend it said something different. She thought about a man in a recovery room 3 floors up, who was eating solid food now and would be transferred to a secure facility in 2 days, carrying whatever he was carrying toward whatever it was meant to accomplish, and who had looked at her with dark, steady eyes in a trauma bay and recognized something that most of the people in this building had spent 8 months not seeing. She thought about the Christmas card that would come in December, addressed in careful, deliberate handwriting to the studio apartment, and about what she would write back this year that was different from what she'd written before. She didn't know yet. She'd figure it out. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors were closing when Tristan Merck, second-year resident, good at procedures, terrible at hiding his feelings, came around the corner at a pace that suggested he'd been looking for her and had timed this badly, and he got his hand in the door gap with approximately 1 second to spare. The doors opened. He looked at her. He was the one who had exhaled through his nose in Bay 4, the morning of the confrontation, the one who'd heard and understood and said nothing because the cost was too high. He'd been thinking about that, it was obvious from his face, thinking about it in the specific ongoing way of someone who was still doing the accounting. "I should have said something," he said. "That morning. With Vale." Emily looked at him. "Yes. I didn't." "No." He was quiet for a moment, which was more honest than if he'd explained or apologized. "I won't do that again." "Good," Emily said. "That's all it takes. Once you decide you won't, you won't." She held the door with her hand. "Get to your rounds, Merck. You have patience." He nodded and stepped back, and she let the door close and the elevator descended, and she stood in the small moving box and breathed. And when the doors opened on the ground floor, she walked through the lobby, past the fish tank and the coffee cart and the front desk, and through the sliding glass doors into the Crestfield morning, which was cold and gray and smelled like rain that had stopped an hour ago and would start again by noon. She stood outside the hospital for a moment. She wasn't naive about what had happened here. The network had been fractured, not destroyed. Networks didn't destroy the way individual crimes did. They fragmented and reconstituted and found new entry points. And the work of the reviews and the prosecutions and the institutional corrections would be long and imperfect and would not fully undo the years during which the damage had been invisible. Vale's name would stay on the wing for a while because the institution would need to build a legal case for removal, and that would take time. And for a while, every person who walked past those letters would be living in the gap between what the institution said it was and what it had actually been. That gap was real, and it mattered, and it was not going to close quickly or cleanly, but it was going to close. That was the thing she had decided to hold on to, not as comfort exactly, but as working principle. Gaps closed when people refused to normalize them. When nurses read lactate results and said what they said, regardless of who was in the room. When security supervisors trusted calls from nurses they'd never been briefed about. When surgeons locked OR doors because someone they'd known for 8 months told them to, and they chose to believe it. When residents stood in elevator doorways at 7 in the morning and said, "I won't do that again." Not perfect, not clean, not the way it looked in the version of the story where everything resolved into clarity and everyone learned their lesson at the right moment, but real. The way real things were real, rough-edged and slow and contingent on people who could have looked the other way and chose not to. Emily pulled her jacket tighter against the October air and thought about the 4 hospitals and the 14 patients upstairs and Mrs. Okafor going home. Tuesday, and the consultation paperwork that was sitting on her kitchen table waiting to be signed, and the studio apartment with the window that faced the valley, where the rain would come in by noon and the mountains would disappear behind the clouds, the way they always did this time of year, temporary and predictable and fine. She went back inside. She had work to do, and she knew how to do it, and she was exactly where she needed to be. That was enough. For now, and maybe for a long time, that was more than enough.